Welcome to Manhwa Recaps, spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. Thank you to all of the super thanks so far, and for the recent Ko-Fi donation, I really appreciate it. Thank you to TokyoTreat and Sakura Co for sponsoring this video. TokyoTreat is a monthly pop Japanese snack subscription box with some of the most exclusive and seasonal flavored snacks. The current theme is the Osaka Snackation. Sakura Co is also a monthly subscription box, but with authentic snacks and Japanese tableware. This month's theme is mochi and fruit. Both of these snack boxes aim to allow you to experience Japan from the comfort of your home. They give you a booklet filled with information about the snacks, including allergens. From the pop collection, my favorite snacks were the melon soda, which was very refreshing compared to regular soda. The chocolate orange Kit Kats remind me of a Valentine's chocolate. And easily the most addicting thing is the bourbon chocolate bread bites. From the authentic collection, it came with a chrysanthemum dish, which is a very beautiful plate. The melon gaufrettes, which are thin wafers with a sweet cream in the middle. And finally, the Ichigo mochi manju, it had a sweet and chewy bite. Here's a video of the boxes I have received, including the booklets I mentioned before, along with some of the snacks and the dish. I'd highly recommend these boxes to anyone who likes Japanese snacks, or even if you've never tried them. It's the perfect experience. Check the pinned comment for $5 off for your first box. The manhwa starts with a man saying he hated the world, and we see him being beaten by 3 men in an alley. He says he hates the world, as there was no reason to like it as he was treated like an animal. This led to the man not trusting anyone. We see the man fighting off a group, and explaining how he is alone, and at the start of 2020, the world changed. Dungeons popped up around the world, and monsters flooded from the gates. This led to cities being destroyed, and many deaths. Mystical beings called Nimbus also appeared, and gave those designated as players authority. People believed that players could save the world, but the players instead took advantage of the chaos from the gates and used it for selfish gain. Everyone thought this would be the end of the world, but for the man, it didn't affect him, because he didn't trust anyone. That is until he met Se-Jun Lee, one of the first players. He was the strongest player, and he protected the weak. Se-Jun declared he would kill the boss, and put an end to the game, thus saving the world. He formed a guild called Messiah, and the other heroes worldwide slowly flocked to Se-Jun, and it was the first time he had comrades he could trust, and follow along with. And if it was them, he thought they could change the world. We see them approaching the final door, and the man says it's time for the final battle, and Se-Jun tells him it is the final battle for him, and we learn the man's name is Woojin Kim. When he turns around, he gets stabbed by Se-Jun, and he tells him he did well. And that if it weren't for him, he wouldn't have been able to make it this far. Woojin has fallen under a curse, and his stats were heavily reduced. He asks Se-Jun if this was his plan from the start, and why. A woman walks out from the shadows, and says that once the final dungeon disappears, everything else will too, and nobody will obey them anymore, so they can't rule the world. The woman's name is Shinhei Park. Woojin looks up at the two and screams as the poison begins to spread throughout his body. Shinhei compliments his resistances, and tells him that just the poison alone was enough for everyone else. He asks what she means, and he is shocked when he realizes what she means. He tells her that they trusted in them, and they really wanted to change the world, yet they still got rid of them. She tells Woojin thanks to him dealing with all of the bosses, they should easily be able to control the world now. Woojin yells out for Se-Jun to say something, but he walks away from him. Woojin realizes there wasn't anyone to trust from the start, and this is how he died. A status window appears saying, starting the game. Woojin suddenly hears voices of multiple people talking, and then opens his eyes and is confused about what is going on. Just a minute ago, he was stabbed by Balmung, and died, and now he is wearing his military uniform, and wondering if he's dreaming. The truck he is riding in suddenly comes to a halt, and we see there are orcs in the street, and the driver yells, telling the soldiers to get their weapons out. The soldiers quickly dismount, and the orcs notice them, and begin charging at them. One of the men yells out, telling everyone to only shoot when they are sure it'll hit, but is interrupted by the sounds of gunshots. And they all look over to see Woojin, mowing down the orcs. He quickly kills 2 more orcs, then evades one of their attacks, and kills it too. He lands on his feet, and the last orc begins to run in fear, but he gives it a free haircut. The other soldiers are surprised by how quickly he eliminated the orcs, wondering how that's even possible. Woojin confirms that the sensations he's having are too real to be a dream. The man from earlier approached him and yells at him, but Woojin ignores him, because he knows it's not a dream, and that he's truly returned to the past. He sits down while the other soldiers gossip about him, and he thinks about Shinhai and Sejin, but he suddenly hears a sound in his ear, and a status window appears, saying he has awoken as a player. He sees a pop-up that shows his class options, but is surprised that there are 3 options. One of them is called Agent of the Dark World, and it allows one to control curses, poison, and dead mobs. And unlike the other classes, the authority is heavily biased, and resulted in one player monopolizing all of it. The player was John Georg, or King of the Undead, and he was the opposite of Sejin, the hero. And in order to defeat him, Woojin meticulously analyzed the man's class, so now he will become a monster and hunt down Sejin. It cuts to an explanation of guilds, and how there was a guild called Phoenix, that paved the way for the Messiah Guild, and then were introduced to their headquarters. We see them offering Woojin a contract, and he asks how he'll prove his qualifications as a player, because nobody but the player can see their window. The man hits him with the Nerd special, and pulls out skill pages for Woojin's class, saying if he's telling the truth, he should be able to rip one of the pages. Woojin looks at the pages, and a skill called Poison Blood catches his eye. He recognizes it, and some of its uses, so he chooses it. He rips the page, and acquires the skill, and it cuts to him recalling a moment in his past life with his comrades, and they make a joke calling him a dog, and then he tells them to prepare for battle, and the flashback ends. Woojin says since he's returned to the past, they are probably alive too, and he should be able to meet them soon. The location changes to a sports park, and we see a group of people in a parking garage, talking about how it's their first time hunting, and they are waiting on their last member. They hear the car, and turn to see an old beetle, and they comment on how he's late. A girl from the group calls his car ass, and another one comments on how he looks poor too, and that they shouldn't pay him any attention. One of the men in the group tells the rest that they can just pretend they are a man down. It cuts to them finishing their briefing, and we see they are raiding a goblin's lair, and the man who briefed everyone gets them to double check their inventories, and we see Woojin saying that since he doesn't know anyone here, he won't need to worry. They head to the dungeon, and one of the group members is surprised by the size of the gate, and they all head in. On the other side, they are no longer in the downtown of a city, but in a forest. One of them says it's like they've entered a game, and Baldy tells everyone to stay alert because it isn't a game. Woojin inspects some of the surroundings, and notices there will be a lot of goblins, and Baldy approaches him, and tells him to scout the area while they set up camp. He agrees and walks off. One of the members laugh calling him an idiot for agreeing after he's left, because it's dangerous, and Baldy tells everyone now all of the items will belong to them. Woojin recognizes he's being used as bait, and says he predicted as much. It cuts to the Messiah Guild, and we see Shinye introducing a new member to everyone, and a shadowy figure enters the room. One of the members, Ji-Hu Yang, who looks like an orc, is annoyed, and the figure introduces himself, saying his name is Suzuki Eiichi. The man tells everyone that since everyone else looks familiar, there won't be any need to introduce himself, and Sei-jun tells the man he has guts, and introduces himself. Suzuki asks what he will be doing from now on. And the orc-like man gets angry, asking where his manners are. We're introduced to more of the Messiah Guild, and Suzuki asks Piggy why he's angry, and if he was rude, or if it's because he's holding a grudge. Sejin tells them to stop, and the orc quickly sits down, saying he'll get his revenge. Shinye says that's enough for greetings, and asks how long they'll have to wait. Suzuki tells her it's just that finding the location of the material is difficult, so 3 days. Sejin says that's not bad, and it cuts back to the dungeon Woojin is in. He's inspecting a tree and smirks while saying it seems all of the rumors about the dungeon are true, and that it's almost funny since almost everything he was taught was by Suzuki. He recalls one of his teachings, and we see their conversation about how regardless of your strength, you will have a weakness. And Woojin realizes he was talking about the guild. Not only was Suzuki a ruthless killer for the guild, but he was also their loyal dog, and now the teaching he taught Woojin will be used against him. A rock quickly flies at Woojin, but he dodges it, and we see 3 goblins square up with him. He pulls a dagger out of his inventory, and he cuts his hand, saying that the goblins will be a good target to test his poison blood on. One of them charges him, and begins to swing its club, but Woojin dodges and stabs it in the arm, then pulls his dagger out. The goblin is now afflicted with the skill, and swings at him again, but he dodges, and Woojin comments on how the skill must not be effective if the goblin isn't affected. One of them leaps at him, and he dodges as it slams its club into the ground, and he yeets his dagger into its skull, instantly killing it. He comments on how they won't be difficult to deal with, but if he drags it on any longer, they'll just keep showing up. He pulls out the whip, not a car, and we see that the whip has a fear effect for goblins built into it. They are terrified, and he says he's glad he prepared it beforehand. It cuts back to the group inside the dungeon with Woojin, and they hear movement behind them, and turn around to see a horde of goblins charging at them. The girl screams and puts her hands up in fear. She feels blood splash onto her face, and opens her eyes to see Baldy has protected her. Everyone calls out to Baldy, and he tells them it'll be light work. Piggy tries to pull his sword out of the corpse, but it gets stuck, and one of the goblins bonks him in the think tank, causing him to fall to the floor. Piggy gets up and starts crawling to everyone, asking for help, and tells them to stop just watching. Two of the members charge in to help him, and it cuts to one of the goblins being sliced down its chest. Woojin smiles, and we see a goblin try to run from him, but he latches his whip around its throat and breaks its neck. He levels up, and we see a status window saying he's being noticed appears. He says the standard must be low if this is all it took to be noticed, and he says that only fools will waste their time swinging a heavy weapon around because even a whip is enough for a goblin. We see the group sitting down, and one of the members asks what they think happened to the newcomer, and Piggy says he's probably dead, and they begin arguing because Piggy was the one who made him go alone. The girl is terrified, and suddenly, they all hear the sound of a goblin, and they instantly panic and group up. It cuts back to Woojin, and he's leveled up again, and unlocked the ability to summon a skeleton soldier. He's surprised he's got the skill already, and explains how Georg abused it to create an army, but it had a flaw that allowed Woojin to capture him. And that is, you can only summon mobs you had killed, which was part of the flaw. Woojin quickly learns the skill, and approaches a goblin corpse, and we see the corpse's flesh begins to melt, and the skeleton rises from it. Woojin looks at the skeleton, and says he likes its eyes. We see the skeleton standing over a goblin corpse, and Woojin wonders why it's so much weaker than his expectations. And says it's too weak to use as his main attack. We see the remains of some players on the wall, and he comments on how monsters exist to harm humans, so he needs to remain merciless to them. Nighttime comes, and we see the group he came with sitting around a fire, and they are panicked, worrying about what they should do now. Piggy starts yelling that he can't die like this, and everyone looks at him, shocked. He tries to encourage them by saying sure, they struggled, but they can do this. And they point out to him they aren't staring at him, and point behind him. And they see the level up notification, and Piggy is lost. Get this man a map. He says, how they are leveling up when they aren't fighting. And they realize the only way they can level up while idle, is when a party member is in combat, and that Woojin must be alive. We see Woojin at a goblin cave, and he has it barricaded off with logs, and he explains the most effective way to kill is by doing this, and he throws a torch onto the logs. We see the logs are consumed in fire, and the goblins inside begin to be consumed by the smoke, and begin to pass out. Some of them try to run to the entrance to escape, but the flaming barricade blocks them. Woojin watches as they scramble, trying to escape the smoke, and they end up BB-ching themselves, while screaming. Woojin smiles as he watches, and the screams slowly fade as the fire rages. We see the aftermath, and he talks about wanting to see someone's face but doesn't specify who, and wonders if he has a different hiding spot. The ground rumbles, and we see a giant goblin emerge, and Woojin says it's a relief that he's appeared, because it's who he has been waiting for. And he's grateful the goblin champion has shown itself. He explains how before the Messiah Guild could intervene, the champion killed a lot of rookies, and that meeting the champion in a dungeon like this would be instant death, but he doesn't plan to allow any more victims. Woojin watches as the skeleton gets into a fighting stance, and the skeleton's expression changes. Woojin leans against a tree and watches as the skeleton dashes toward the champion, and the skeleton quickly dashes between its legs, slicing its heel. Woojin recognizes the technique, and at one point in the past, when they were up against some giant monster, Woojin explained to everyone that they needed to attack its legs, and he demonstrated it to them by performing 2 slashes. He says he's certain it's the same movement. And we watch as the champion falls to his knees, and the skeleton quickly dashes behind it. Woojin immediately recognizes the fighting style as his own. He knew that the skeleton's strength would be affected by his magic skill, but didn't know it would also copy his fighting style. He starts to mansplain to Skelly Bones, and decides he'll have to change his plan after learning this. He gets interrupted by a status window, that's alerting him that he's obtained a legendary skill page. He's clearly excited by the skill he obtains, then it cuts to outside the dungeon, and people are shouting that the dungeon has been cleared. Everyone runs to the gate, and we see the inting bot Lane walk out from it. One of the managers is shooketh that it only took a day, and is glad they returned, but notices it's only 4 people and asks where Woojin is. They donawall him, of course, and he's prepared for the worst, but then someone yells that another person is coming out, and everyone is surprised to see Woojin. He ignores them, and the gate closes behind him. The manager runs him down, and Baldy wonders how he cleared the dungeon by himself, and then wonders who he is. We see on the news that Sejin has cleared another floor in the dungeon, and the stock group of the Messiah Guild sponsor has skyrocketed. And Baldy is swiping left on Tinder while malding about how players are going to seem like greedy trash, and another man at the bar tells him not to worry, and asks what the deal with the dungeon was this time. Baldy tells the man not to even ask, because he almost died because of a newbie, then blames the bandages on his head as Woojin's fault. And the man asks Baldy if the rumor is accurate, and Baldy explains that Woojin wanted to get an item, so he rushed into a group of enemies, and that he jumped in to save Woojin, which is why he's bandaged up. The man says that Woojin should be punished, and they talk about it for another minute. Then it cuts to Woojin playing detective, saying he can't get close to Sejin this time, and he has to be strong enough before Sejin is interested in him. He has his detective wall pretty well mapped out, and picks up one of the notes that mentioned an orc hunter. Woojin then heads into an office building, asking to participate in the orc dungeon, and one of the men asks him if he's trying to redeem himself because of the rumor. Woojin says he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that he needs money. The other man at the table tells Woojin that he should worry about his life first, and not his money, and even offers him a loan. Woojin says he'd prefer to go to the dungeon. It cuts to after the meeting, and we see the 2 men from the meeting discussing how the rumors are true about Woojin, and one of them asks what's the status of the dungeon he's trying to enter. The other man tells him that a man named Yongyu Joan had his party wiped, and how the man was a rising star, and even he failed. They decide to support Woojin, and see how it goes. Woojin then says that in order to kill a hero, the first step is to grab hands with the villains. It cuts to Woojin at the area of the dungeon, and we see a manager run up to him, asking if he's really alone. Then calls him a loner, but guides him to the dungeon even though he thinks he's crazy. We see the gate, and now inside of it, Woojin looks at his stats, and realizes that it may be too much for him to handle, but if he can kill one orc and make it a skeleton, he'll be fine. An orc quickly approaches from behind and attacks him, but Woojin slides under its legs, then breakdances and cuts its legs, but barely scratched it because its skin is thick. And he realizes that based on the orc's power, he's dead if he gets bonked, but if he can make him a skeleton, then clearing the dungeon is possible. They lock eyes, and then the orc swings at him again, but he dodges while being scraped by debris. He quickly gets behind it, and then dashes towards its heels again, striking the wound from before, and then slashes its legs over and over. He dashes in front of the orc, but it cannot do anything, and then we see blood pour out of its legs, and he falls to his knees. Woojin tells it that without its legs, it's just a dirty creature, then gives him a haircut. Then the status window appears, saying the skeleton soldier has been summoned. It cuts to 2 men talking, we aren't introduced to them, and one of them says what he's looking at is interesting, and the other man asks him what he's looking at, and asks if he's being a weirdo again. The man tells him he can see it for himself, and passes him a clipboard. He looks down, and we see Woojin's information, and is confused by how a newbie cleared a dungeon solo. The other man tells him that it seems like Woojin entered his second dungeon alone. The other man says there's no way, because even he struggled a lot at first, and then says it's just fake news, and while he's calling him gullible, a woman walks in and then asks if there's something wrong with her report. He panics and says it makes sense now if Secretary Lee was the one who made it, and that he thought it was too perfect, then asks how she got such high quality info. She slams the drinks onto the table, saying it's because it's her work, and the other man says that it's 100% trustworthy if it's from Lee, but then looks down to see instant coffee packets, and then turns into Mega Mind while barking at her, for buying instant coffee. He then asks for her excuse, and she says she bought it a while ago, and her report was made with reusable paper. The man instantly changes his mood, saying it's the best, and transforms into Buddha while singing her praises. The other man stares at his bald-ass head, and says that's why he's bald. The man then asks Lee how the purchases of dungeons is going, and she says there are a few good ones. The man with hair then asks the baldo about their other dungeons. The bald man then hints at how the other man will be entering it, and then he begins saying he deserves to rest. The bald man then tells him if someone rests for too long, they become lazy. It cuts back to the orcs, and we see they are fighting Woojin's skeleton, and he comments on how the durability is weak, but he learned something from Georg in his previous life, and he turns another corpse into a soldier. The orcs watch as it begins to form from their fallen comrade, and Woojin says as long as he has mana, the number of soldiers he is will always be the same as the number of sacrifices on the battlefield. The orcs begin to feel fear, and then get off-screened. We see he levels up, and his poison blood skill levels. He's surprised by how fast he leveled, and says that it will be ineffective to level here, and he should look for the orc hunter already. He thinks about it and begins to try and work out where the hunter is. He starts by drawing in the dirt, and while he's eliminating spots the hunter can be in, we see Mr. Skelly Bones peeping at what he's drawing. Skelly Bones is totally lost, and Woojin keeps trying to pinpoint where the hunter is at. And if it's where he thinks it is, the only soldier he can use would be Mr. Skelly Bones, and he decides that he needs a different plan. It cuts to an orc's pearly whites, and we see it dragging another orc, turning him into a meat crayon. Woojin watches, hiding from the hunter, and explains that a dungeon boss is much stronger than a normal monster, and it would be dumb to fight without a plan, but if he can pierce it with his poison blood arrow, it might work. He nods to Skelly, and we see Skelly walk out into the open, to which the hunter quickly notices, and the two begin to charge at each other. They clash, trading blows, and then the hunter begins to bite Skelly, and based on the eyes of the hunter, Woojin confirms its identity, and says that he has to avoid the thick skin. He shoots an arrow toward the hunter's eye, piercing it. The hunter stands his ground and then pulls the arrow out of his eye. We see the poison has affected the hunter, and Woojin explains that the weaker the area, the faster the poison will spread. The hunter begins to make a weird sound, and another status window appears, saying that the hunter's health will decrease. It falls to its knees, and Woojin mentions that it won't be fatal, but it's useful for stuff like this, and now it's over. Skelly kills it, and Woojin approaches a pile of remains from what the hunter killed. Woojin kicks them, and notices one of the injuries wasn't dealt by the hunter, but rather it was the action of someone who was used to murder. This means he's on the right track, but there's not enough time left in the dungeon to get closer to the murderer, but it would be nice if he could find something to get closer to Yongwan Park. He sees a shiny object from a cave, and decides to go to it. He crouches into the cave, and sees a skeleton in armor, with an oddly clean weapon. This means that while his allies were being slaughtered, he just sat in here counting his days, and we learn the corpse belonged to the rising star of the Phoenix Guild. He notices a book beside the bones, and opens it. He says it has no important information, but then he finds out that it's actually a blacklist for the Yongwen faction, and he can make good use of this. Woojin gets a gift for soloing the hunter, and obtains a legendary skill called the Eye of Anubis, and can look into the memories of the dead, and he makes a joke about how his luck is good in this life. He puts his hands on the skeleton's head and activates his skill while making a bad one-liner. His eyes begin to cloud, and a shadowy aura emerges from them. A beam flows into the skeleton's eyes, and we get a flashback of his memories. We see him stressing over his allies dying, and how he was killing humans with the backing of the Phoenix Guild. He deactivates his skill, and is confused by the memories, saying that it wasn't a pleasant experience, and it consumes a lot of mana. But now, his preparation is over, but with all of this new information, he's in a good position. It cuts to a man being beaten because of someone else clearing a dungeon, and then the man gets dragged out while begging for a second chance. Park Yongwan is reading a paper about Woojin, and asks about his reputation. His secretary explains about Woojin's past raids, and even mentions the rumor of him being greedy, and while they are discussing Woojin, Yongwan is alerted that someone is at the office to see him, and that someone is Woojin. It cuts to two dungeon managers discussing how the slots are assigned how many people can fit into a dungeon, and that there are a lot of empty spots this time around, and it's going to be difficult to find people to fill them. They suddenly get notified that Yongwen called them, and that he's asking for Woojin to be put into the dungeon, but since Woojin is a loner, the other guilds won't care if he's there. They discuss how they will handle putting Woojin into the dungeon group, and they misinterpret the situation as Yongwan being some genius with Woojin as his trump card. It cuts back to Yongwan, and his secretary is asking why he accepted Woojin's proposal, and he says it was fun seeing him bring the blacklist book like that, and that Woojin is someone he can manipulate and throw away when he's done. We get a flashback of Yongwan holding the book, asking if Woojin is trying to blackmail him, and he tells him no, but instead, he has a proposal for him, and that he would like to enter the A+ dungeon. Yongwan laughs at him, and asks if he's aware of what kind of place that dungeon is, and Woojin tells him yes, and he's aware the Phoenix and Messiah guilds are fighting over slots for the dungeon. Yongwan calls him insane for wanting to enter while knowing that, and agrees to his proposal on one condition, but doesn't say what. It cuts to a university, and we see Woojin attending a seminar on the dungeon report, and we learn it has over 1,000 orcs, and an orc champion. Woojin comments on how in the past, the survivors of this attack were only 70 people out of the 150 entering, and considering all of the people participating are elites, there's no way that many would from just monsters. So there is a high likelihood that the players were murdered, probably so their items could be stolen. The reward for killing the champion is the Orc Fang, which was given to Sejin in his past life. Woojin says even if Sejin is the one behind the killings, the Messiah guild probably didn't do it themselves, but used a spy in another guild instead, and he plans to use his past life to predict their next move. It cuts to the gate, and we see a large group entering. The big guilds are all there, and even a few smaller ones. Woojin says his first goal is to take the Orc champion's loot. One of the Messiah members yells for their guild to take the front line, and others look on in awe, and another one says that just because they move first, it won't matter. Someone yells that there's an orc, and we see it standing in front of the Messiah guild. A man with a giant shield says the Messiah guild will get rid of it. He slams his shield into the ground, taunting the orc to attack him. It hits the shield, and pushes the tank backward. The orc is surprised, and the tank asks if that's all, and a mage begins to speak eldritch creature, and giant vines appear and restrain the orc. The orc screams while trying to break the vines. The players then feel the ground rumbling, and wonder what is going on. They begin to get nervous as they realize the rumbling they hear is a stampede of orcs. The orcs and players engage in combat, and some of the players get bodied, but some casters send rocks flying toward the orcs, and the Messiah guild rushes in to create a front line. Woojin watches from atop a tree, and realizes that nobody will notice if he disappears, and now it's time for him to move. The orcs won't push back the players, so he plans to find the orc champion while they are busy, and the clear condition is both the champion, and the 1,000 orcs, so the big guilds will try to reduce the numbers first. But during this time, Woojin can get the Orc Fang before the rest of them. It cuts to a random area in the dungeon, and we see a group of orcs, and one on a throne, with the fang around its neck. They execute one of the kneeling orcs, and his head rolls. The other orcs watching are afraid, and the champion raises his axe into the air and shouts. The other orcs listen to his screech and begin walking toward the players. Woojin is glad he found the champion, mainly because he just sent his underlings away. Now, while fighting in the front line, he can fight the champion. It cuts to the Messiah guild over a large number of orc bodies, and tells them they should keep pushing ahead. The man from the guild realizes the number they've fought is too little, so the actual main force is somewhere else. A man quickly appears, telling him a large number of orcs are charging straight for them. And it's around 900 orcs. It looks like their entire main force. He yells, telling everyone that's enough for the day, and that they will need more equipment to go against the whole army of orcs. This causes some of the other guilds to get butthurt, and they start yelling they aren't the Messiah guild's dogs. The Messiah guild tries telling them while competition is important, if they split up, they will all die. One of the men tells him that if he isn't confident, he shouldn't have entered in the first place, and his guild walks off. The Messiah guild ignore them and decide to rest and prepare for the next fight. It cuts back to the actual content, and we see Woojin with two skelly bones standing before the champion. The champion begins walking toward them, and we see Woojin has the blood poison arrow ready. One of the skeletons rush in, but the champion's fang activates, and he instantly destroys one of the skeletons. Woojin is surprised, and then the champion brings down his weapon onto the other one, but it evades and dashes toward its leg. The champion begins to kick at the skeleton, and Woojin realizes that he won't have much time, and that there's only one chance. And right now, while there's only one soldier left, We see the last Skelly dodge yet another attack, and then Woojin's arrow flies through the air at the champion, but he dodges it. Woojin realizes he's stronger than what he's heard about. Skelly takes this chance and attacks, but the sword it's using breaks, and the champion doesn't miss a beat, and shatters Skelly. Woojin realizes this is troublesome, and he needs to change plans. Woojin says it will be impossible to fight the champion while it has the fang, and it would be better to retreat because his mana is low too. He begins to run, but it doesn't follow him, and he's confused as to why. The champion turns his head, and Woojin quickly flees, saying it's good he can freely leave, because the boss found it troublesome to chase him, but he will make it regret letting him go. We see some of the minor character guilds see Woojin running, and one of them says maybe Woojin found the champion before them, and the leader says they won't know, but they should confirm it themselves first. Because the drops should be claimed by their guild first, but we see them all start passing out, and the man begins to panic because he hasn't heard about any monsters other than orcs, and then he realizes it's not orcs, and he begins to scream then turns into a liquid. Woojin makes it back to main base, and he says it's good there aren't any factions taking interest in him, but realizes the mood is very heavy. He's surprised so many people died on day one, and realizes something must be wrong, and wonders if the guilds have started fighting already. He watches as some no-names talk amongst themselves, but they quickly comment on how it's strange that there aren't any survivors. Woojin is sure there's someone behind all of the attacks and murders, and he understands that his plan will fail if the main forces weaken more, so he must get to work. Some orcs begin to walk out of the forest, and the players are afraid, and we see them squaring up like a Lord of the Rings fight. Woojin watches from afar as dust clouds form, and he realizes it must have started. But the problem is still how he will be able to injure the champion with his current items, because he can't use the skeleton soldiers as bait as their durability is too low. He has an epiphany, and wonders if the skeletons can shoot arrows. We see the status window say he's summoned one, while he's standing in front of the champion. Woojin comments on how relaxed the champion is, and says it's time for round 2. The orc activates the fang and stands up from his throne, then instantly charges at Woojin, and while it's in the air, an arrow flies toward its head, but it deflects the arrow, then looks over to see 2 skeletons with bows. It smacks the floor, then golfs the debris at the skeletons, to which they quickly dodge, and shoot more arrows, but they are blocked. Woojin is above the champion, and is glad the skeletons are doing as expected, so it's all going as planned. Woojin quickly Beyblades while in the air, and slashes down its chest, breaking the necklace that holds the fang. The fang drops to the ground, and lands in Woojin's hand. He activates it, and the champion begins to weaken. It smashes at Woojin, but he evades, and then 2 arrows land into the orc's leg, which poisons it. It looks over at the skeletons, and Woojin is glad he has the fang now. We can see the item is pretty good, and then he earns a title for having it. He turns emo and cuts himself on his sword, and the fight continues. The champion tries to kill the skeletons, but they avoid him and continue to shoot arrows, and while he blocks one, another lands straight into his gut. Woojin takes this chance and rushes in, and the champion swings at him, but he surfs that shit, and uses the momentum to stab its arm. It releases the axe, then Woojin dismounts the orc, while the axe is sent flying. One of the skeletons catches it, but is slow mentally, so takes a second to drop his bow and prepares to use the axe. It cuts to some random dude in the trees nearby, and he hears the champion's roar, but wonders who is fighting against it, and he needs to see then quickly report it. He sees from atop the cliff the 2 Mr. Skelly Bones and Woojin are toying with the champion, and he gets frightened of our boy, and runs away. But Woojin heard him and smirks. The man continues to run until an arrow launches into his shoulder, and he falls to the floor, then, wonders who attacked him, and wonders if it was Woojin who saw him previously. He turns around to see an edgelord phase into existence, and then loses his speaking privileges. Then he awkwardly stands over his body. We see the edgelord begins to mark out a picture inside of a book, which looks oddly similar to the blacklist Woojin gave Yongwan. Another edgelord member says to hurry up and steal the man's items, and one of them asks if he really plans to get rid of the man from earlier Woojin, and the other says yes, because he's going to be tired after fighting the champion. And then he leaves, while leaving the rest to the other guy, and he drags the man's corpse away. They weren't aware Woojin was lurking and heard and watched all of this. We see the main guilds have just finished killing a group of orcs, and while they are saying things are progressing smoothly, they all see a status window saying that the orc champion has been defeated. One of the men is shocked. They all begin talking about who it was, and the Messiah Guild representative is confused because all of the main guilds are with them. They all misunderstand and think it was the Lion Guild no names from before. It cuts back to a view of an axe being pulled out of an orc, and we see Mr. Skelly Bones has finally killed it, and Woojin levels up. He unlocks a new skill, and hopes he gets something nice, so he rips the page open to find that he got a skill called Botger, which is like an inventory that can store dead monsters. And he goes to try it out, and we see Mr. Skelly Bones gets the life sucked out of him, and it swirls into the book, and then the darkness fades, and this will get rid of the need for him to kill monsters as soon as he enters a dungeon, and this gets rid of one of his most significant weaknesses. One of the men from before that saw the notification about the champion is running through the woods, but we're going to skip their boring dialogue, and instead focus on the edgelord gang. They quickly change their mind about killing Woojin, and decide to clean up the rest of the people first. They ask about a newbie, and the white-haired man from before says he'll properly educate him after this is over, and what we can assume is their leader says, they must not be identified, or else they will be in hella trouble. And if they do, they should just unalive themselves. But since they are running out of time, they need to move stealthily. Before they leave, they see the newbie running at them, and behind him are two Mr. Skelly Bones, and then they realize he must have provoked Woojin. They prepare to engage, and they yell at the newbie for leading the Skelly Bones here. And they begin to wonder if maybe Woojin knows something about them, since he decided to attack them, but when he resolves himself to fight, he turns around to see his boys are catching the hands. The newbie was actually Woojin, and they quickly fall to the floor. The leader is still lost, wondering what happened, and he wonders if the newbie betrayed them. But he sees Woojin take off the cloak, and realizes. It cuts to Woojin reading the memories of the actual newbie, but he couldn't find any memories about the Messiah Guild, but he notices the dead guy, and realizes he was missing in his past life too. He puts the mask on, saying he'll need to meet the master of the edgelords, and he walks off. It cuts back to the present, and we see the leader of the edgelords wondering where he came from, and the Skellies begin approaching the other alive members. Woojin is glad everyone from the newbie's memories are gathered here. The Skelly boys kill the remaining edgelords, and Woojin approaches the leader. The leader realizes Woojin isn't hesitating to murder, and tells him he won't find anything out from him. The leader realizes that even if he lives, he'll be a disgrace. He then commits Sudoku as a joke. Woojin says that was pointless, and then realizes he probably had a lot of information to hide. He activates his think tank reading ability, and the too long didn't read of the flashback explains how some people were trying to monopolize dungeons, and build their own empire called the Yamamoto State. And he introduces the edgelord to the people who will guide him down the right path, and it's two of the men from the Messiah Guild meeting. And that after the dungeon, they will need to kill a dungeon broker named Osei-chan. Woojin feels disgusted, because the two men were his previous comrades, and he conquered many dungeons with them. They were his teachers, and his support, and he trusted them greatly. He refuses to let them have their way this time, and he thinks about their next target, and says that because he doesn't know, second, the assassination was successful, and if the Yamamoto guys were to fill his spot, then Sejin would profit. And since they need to get rid of Second, he can use this like gathering moths to a flame, and he needs a broker anyways, so he should start preparing to exit the dungeon. It cuts to two managers outside the gate talking about how the area will become chaotic once the dungeon is cleared, because the players will be fighting each other. And other than the Messiah Guild, everyone will be trying to get an extra item. One of the men looks surprised, and the other guy calls him annoying, and then makes a pog face, and we see Woojin exiting the dungeon. Everyone starts to exit, and chaos ensues. Because of the number of casualties, the entire edgelord guild was wiped out, and the dungeon rewards are missing. Even Yongwan is annoyed that they can't find the dungeon reward. We see the Phoenix Guild apologizing to Yongwan, and he asks them how they plan to compensate him for his losses, because it isn't a charity business, and he asks them to bring him a large sum of money. They yell, and now they've left. He asks his secretary about Woojin, and she tells him he is in the hospital still. He calls him useless for being injured by a dungeon mob, and then she tells him he said it wasn't from a monster. He asks if she's certain about this, and she says it'd be best to hear it from his mouth, and Yongwan tells her they should go ahead and go to the hospital. We see a man leaving Woojin's room, telling him to contact him if he remembers anything, and when he's walking away, he is sighing that Woojin doesn't remember anything. Then he passes Yongwan while he's entering the elevator. Yongwon catches the guy's mood, and realizes Woojin isn't talking. He enters his room, and asks Woojin how he's feeling. It skips the recap that Woojin gives him, and then Yongwon says he's never heard of the Skull Guild edgelords, and Woojin tells him that he saw them attack the champion, so whoever killed them took their items, and they were using a skill called covert. Yongwon says he recognizes the skill, and he's confident they were targeting other players, and Woojin tells him that if it weren't for his bloody poison skill, he would have died. Yongwon tells him he's lucky, since all of the edgelords died, he's the only one who witnessed it. Woojin then asks if the Phoenix Guild were able to get anything, and Yongwon molds thinking about it. And he thinks that in order to minimize his losses, he needs to get as much info about the edgelords as possible. He tells Woojin to drop the innocent act, and tell him what he wants. And that he approached Yongwon with something in mind. Woojin tells him he wants to find a person, and then asks him to help him find Second. Yongwon then tells him that he needs to pick up his phone when an unknown number calls, and he goes to leave while saying that Second is arrogant and is picky with his clients, and he reminds Woojin to stay quiet, because rumors will be dangerous. Woojin tells him he knows, and Yongwon says they'll meet again. Woojin begins to sit up, and says everything is going to his plan, and even if Yongwon doesn't know about the relationship between the Messiah Guild and the edgelords, he will dig into it. This will make the Messiah Guilds turn their attention to Yongwon, and he finds it funny that Yongwon doesn't even know that Woojin's injuries are self-inflicted, and that he can use this opportunity of them fighting to gain strength. It cuts to Yongwon in his car, explaining how because the edgelords don't have a sponsor, it means they are selling items abroad, so he will need to investigate the black markets to find out more. We see Woojin walking, and he says he should have been contacted by now, and plot convenience happens, and he receives a call. He hears a voice saying he heard he wanted to strike a deal with him. And Woojin tells him he needs dungeons, and Second says the deal can be finalized after he sees his skills, and he'll text him the details later. He receives a text about a dungeon, and Woojin thinks it'll be great if he can make a deal with Second. It cuts back to the two men previously, and we learn that the bald man is actually Second, and the other man still hasn't been identified. Still, he tries to warn Second about if Woojin potentially wants to harm him, and Second says if he's skilled enough to kill him, then that's good, because it would mean he will be talented enough to destroy the dungeons and clear the game. The other man asks how he can say that, when he's sitting right here. The other man tells him that he still has a long way to go, because he can't even solo a dungeon. Second says he sent Woojin to a kobold dungeon, so they'll see how it goes, and then they banter, and it cuts back to Woojin approaching a gate. Woojin says that kobolds are hard for normal players, but that's only for those who don't know how to defeat them. We see Secretary Lee watching Woojin enter the dungeon, and she asks if she should turn the timer on. Second is surprised at how quick he is, and asks her if he brought anything, and she says no. He thinks he's reckless or dumb, and the other guy says it seems as if he's just overconfident. Second wonders about if it isn't a bluff. It cuts to a member of the Messiah Guild talking to the two Japanese masters Woojin's comrades he mentioned previously, and the messenger Jae-hoon says there wasn't much damage, and one of the men get angry, saying 5 of his men died. Jae-hoon realizes it was a mistake to say that, and the other says they were only there because Sejin asked them to go, and he asks if he's meant to believe that his men died due to just orcs. Jae-hoon bows and apologizes profusely, saying he'll investigate it properly, and they tell him don't bother, and offers him a drink. Because regardless of how things went, they are in an alliance with the Messiah Guild, and he wants him to know how deeply insulted they were. He purposefully misses Jae-hoon's cup, and tells him if there were any issues between comrades, sharing alcohol helps to smooth things over, if they were comrades, of course. Jae-hoon realizes he done goofed and that he needs a new plan. It cuts to the masters leaving, and they talk about how no one on their hit list killed their men, and the only people left are the Phoenix Guild, but leave it open that it might have been an unknown party. It cuts to some people near the kobold dungeon, and they are talking about how Woojin went in solo, and how he's not sane, and any minute now, the gate will activate and open again. They hear the sound of the gate, and the other guy with an afro says it looks like he was right, and the man tells him that's wrong, and that the dungeon has been cleared. They quickly scramble to find out where Woojin is, and Afro Man points out that he's already in his car and leaving. Second yells at them for letting him go, and for taking his money if they aren't doing their job, and Secretary Lee covers her ears, and tells him she didn't pay them, because they are from Second's hometown, and came to help him. Second seems confused, and she tells him that he planned to take them out for drinks as payment, and he tells her too bad because he just quit drinking, and she makes the Saitama okay face. She tells him that she'll take her leave now, and not to worry, because he'll contact them soon if he has plans to work with them. He calls her cold, and recalls how he first met her, and we see she was found in some rubble. The other man comes back with a bag full of food, asking if something happened, and Second says she had somewhere to go, and informs him that Woojin cleared the dungeon, but asks why he has so much damn food. They banter again, and it cuts back to Woojin driving, and he sees on his car a walkie-talkie, and a piece of paper, and he wonders if they are truly planning to make a deal with him or not. And the paper tells him to contact them during their working hour. It cuts to a car, and we see Jae-hoon wondering how he's going to fix this, and he receives a phone call about the Skull Guild, and quickly drives off. It cuts to Young-won talking to someone about dealing with an issue quietly, and then we see Jae-hoon from above watching all of this, and wondering how much Young-won knows. Some weirdo approaches Jae-hoon, and says he also wonders how much he knows, and that he also wants to know, because Young-won talked to him and mentioned something strange too. The man tells Young-won that he cannot disclose info about the edgelords, and Young-won says that he knows a secret of the guys who died in the recent dungeon. Jae-hoon is shocked, and realizes that he can't solve this by himself, and that if he reports it to Sejin, then he'll be in trouble. He then asks the other man who Young-won is talking to, and we learn that the man Young-won is talking to is named Jong-hoon Young, and that he's a mercenary who will do anything if you give him money. Young-won finishes his conversation, and Jae-hoon thanks the weirdo for sharing information, and then Jae-hoon looks down while thinking. Then he approaches Hoon Young asking to talk. Young is surprised, and Jae-hoon tells him he's not sure what Young-won told him, but he has a proposition for him, and it's related to cooperating with the Messiah Guild. Young asks him to make it simpler, and Jae-hoon tells him that he's talking about a great business profit, and says this will take longer than he expected. It cuts to Young-won sitting in traffic, and his secretary tells him she secured a public dungeon as he requested, but this is unlike his usual methods, and she's worried it'll complicate things. Young-won tells her the Skull Guild will have to take action against him, in some discreet way, and now that he's set up the stage, it's time for the main star, and he calls Woojin. It cuts back to Jae-hoon alone, and he's anxious thinking about Young-won's plan, and recalls Young telling him about how he and a few others are guarding Woojin, and Jae-hoon finds Woojin's name on the dungeon list. But says there's no way he killed all of the edgelords himself, and that it's an obvious bait, but he's unsure if he should take it. It cuts to Woojin in his car on the walkie-talkie, and he's saying he surely passed their test, and Second replies saying it seems like he hid his skills, and then confirms he wanted to buy a dungeon, so he sent him the list of dungeons he owns and to pick one out. Woojin tells him okay, but he has some things to do first, and he'll call him in a few days. Second says he'll be waiting. Then he has a brief conversation with his employee about while it's risky to trust Woojin, it's part of the job. It cuts to Woojin asking Young-won if he's meant to be bait, and Young-won tells him yes, because somehow their conversation got leaked, so it's a matter of time. And he'll lose his life if he just sits around, and that's he's recruited a few dudes to guard him. Woojin asks if there's a reason he needs to do it, and Young-won tells him yes, and how he owes the other men. Woojin tells him he understands, but he'd like to have more pay, and Young-won thinks that Woojin fell for it, but it was the opposite way around. The secretary tells Woojin that Young-won prepared something for him. We see it's a skill page. Woojin thinks about how in his past life, Young-won actually allied with the Yamato faction, but Woojin is glad by the skill he got. We don't see what it is yet. It cuts to the Phoenix Guild in a dungeon complaining that Young-won sent them here, and we see an edgelord mask lurking in the shadow. It cuts to a group under a bridge, and we see Young getting off the phone with Young-won after telling him the preparation has been completed. And then we see him confirming with someone he needs to hand Woojin to him. And the guy tells him yes, and Young tells him that it seems like they are getting too little money, since they are losing an important customer. We see the man is Jae-hoon, and he tells him that he can always get more after they finish, and find them customers. Young says he would rather strike a deal with Messiah, and if they do, then additional pay won't matter. Jae-hoon tells him he can't do that since it's a personal request. And Young agrees. He and the other mercenaries bow to Jae-hoon leaving. And he tells the rest they'll be rich after this is over. One of them comments how it's weird that Messiah is okay with this, and Young says not everyone is a saint like Sejin, and it doesn't matter, they need to enjoy their life after this job. It cuts to a gate closing, and one of the men waiting outside sees the Skull Guild walking out, while the Phoenix Guild under Yongwon is nowhere to be seen. He asks them to wait, and asks if they know what happened to the Phoenix Guild, and asks for at least an explanation for the families of the deceased. One of the men pulls his mask down, saying he ripped them apart, and they are unrecognizable. The man sweats at his response, and we see the other man tell him that Master warned them not to create any issues. And he tells him he got it. The other man then gets on the phone, and we learn his name is Matsumoto. Matsu says they have more work, and then we see Jaehoon saying the target is entering the dungeon soon, and to hurry. Matsu asks why he needs to listen to him, and Jaehoon says he can't miss this chance. Matsu accepts, and we see on his phone he has the dungeon information. It cuts to daytime, and we see Yongwon realizing there's a foreign faction in Korea, and that he thought it was a waste for him to only work here in Korea, so if things don't go to plan, he'll still have the Skull Guild info. And he looks at his watch, saying it's time, and we see Woojin approaching Young and his group. They tell him to come over, and they trade introductions, and Young says they should do their best, and there's another team that's meant to be joining them. We see a car pull up, and it's the Skull Guild from earlier. Woojin sees them, and asks where the bathroom is. Young follows him, and when Woojin leaves, he asks if he's the one they are meant to escort. And then says it's time to enter, so they should walk and continue their conversation. Young tells him the other group doesn't know they are together, and that Woojin should move alone, but not to worry as they'll have someone following him. Young says it'd be difficult if they started killing each other instantly, and again reassures him that he knows what he is doing, so to trust them. Woojin tells him all right, and Young tells him to go in first, or else it would look suspicious. Young grins and says it's going to be easier than he thought. Inside the dungeon, we see everyone, and that the first floor is mostly just exploration. Young tells everyone to split up, and tells Woojin that since he's alone, they'll send someone to accompany him. The manie's name is Jin Wook, and Young tells everyone to hurry up so they can move to the next floor. We see everyone take off, Young and Woojin nod toward each other, and Woojin realizes the next fight will take place on the second floor. Matsu asks why they aren't killing Woojin now, and we see Jaehoon tell him that the guys he hired will escort him well, and not to worry, and what is the plan as if Woojin tries to run. Matsu asks if he is doubting their skills, and Jaehoon tells him it isn't that deep, and thinks that he just came to kill Young and his men here. It cuts to Young asking his group what Woojin is doing, and one of the men informs him that he's killing orcs. Young begins to ask if there's anything else, and they tell him not to worry that much. Young tells them that Yongwon and Jaehoon wouldn't pay a hefty amount if he's weak, and asks if Jinwook is still following him. And we learn he's planning to go to where they are, and when he lets his guard down, they'll capture him. We see Young and them walking, and one of them says, that Woojin was just here, but now he's gone. Young says he's confident that this is the right place, but is surprised Jinwook isn't showing up. And that it doesn't feel right. One of them points out to Woojin and Jinwook lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Young tells them to check on Jinwook first, and the rest will scout the surroundings, while one of them heals Jinwook. He is quickly shocked and yells out that his neck is injured, and Minshik healer tells him to stop trying to talk because he can't heal him in this state. The man points to Woojin, and Minshik tells him that Woojin isn't important, and to focus on living. Young asks him how Jinwook is, and he tells him he's seriously injured, and that he might die at this rate. Young wonders what happened, and says there's no way they fought, but then recalls his conversation with Jaehoon, and wonders if he was planning to kill them all too. Minshik tells Young to snap out of it, and that Jinwook is bleeding heavily, and that healing magic won't, but is interrupted by Mr. Skelly Bones appearing from behind him, and then slicing him in half. Minshik looks down to see that he got turned into a sandwich, and the rest yell out, and Young realizes they focused the healer on purpose. Young tells the rest he thinks Jaehoon tricked them. The boys surround Young's group, and then it cuts to the edgelords, and one of them is saying the monsters know he's handsome because they keep attacking him. The other one tells him that's not it, and he just reeks. The other guy starts sniffing his pits, and the other guy tells him more of his fans are coming. The man turns around and yoinks one by the throat, and grabs its leg, then opens it like a bag of chips. Another one approaches, and he punches its head off, and stares at the last hyena thing. It cuts back to Young asking why he betrayed them, and we see Woojin off-screen them, and says that even while dying, he isn't being honest. And that his greed crossed the line, even though he was the one who said each person's worth is valued differently. He wonders how he knew that, and he recalls his conversation with his men about how the plan is to capture Wujin, and one of them says if they don't kill him, then Young can't enjoy his hobby, and we see him roll his sleeve down and he's played guitar on his arm. And one of them mock how one of the last people begged for their life, and it would be nice if they had more requests like this. Then Young says the line that Wujin hit him with. And we see Wujin was lurking at the restaurant. Wujin pulls a weapon from his inventory, and says he is curious about how much Young's life is worth as he cuts his head off, and then he walks away. It cuts to night, and Wujin finds a goblin that was hiding, and kills it, saying he needs to head to the next floor since the Skull Gang is waiting for him. They see a beam of light confirming that the first floor has been cleared, and they wonder what happened because Young was meant to wait for him to send a signal if he found the goblin. Matsu says, based on Jae-hoon's reaction, it seems like it's not going according to his plan, and that the first floor has been cleared. It seems like they are going to wait for them on the second floor and kill them. They begin running toward the gate, and Jae-hoon wonders if they found out his real plan. We see Wujin standing in front of the gate, and he opens the door, moving to the second door. It cuts back to Young-won again, and the secretary is telling him that one of the items Wujin bought is strange, and Young-won wonders what he is thinking, buying a collection socket. It cuts back to the gate being opened, and the Skull Gang tells his men that Young's group might be setting up an ambush, and one of them thanked Jae-hoon for making this situation more fun. They walk into the gate, and it shows us the second floor and some giant eye open under some water. Matsu says it's weird that nobody is attacking them, and the stinky dude says they are probably just hiding out of fear, and he steps on a tripwire. We see a lot of arrows fly toward them all, but they block them, breaking the vials of blood on the tips of the arrows, which gets on them. They are confused because it's a collection socket. Matsu says he doesn't understand because it should have been a great chance for them to be attacked, and the stinky guy stays. The blood smells, and Wujin appears, saying he thought it matches how much the dude reeks. Jae-hoon is surprised to see Wujin, and the rest ask where Young is. Wujin realizes they think he's on Young's team, and tells them he knows they were planning to kill them all, and he didn't think that Jae-hoon would follow them all here. But he tells them there isn't enough time to talk, and Matsu hears something approaching them from the water, and we see a giant lizard creature appear, and munches on one of the edgelord's heads. The rest are shocked as they watch the man's feet dangle in its mouth. Matsu yells, asking Wujin what he's done, and Wujin explains that the liquid they are covered in is goblin blood, and it's the lizard's favorite snack. And now they'll become a great dish for it. Matsu yells, saying he'll kill him, and yells while charging at Wujin. Stinky tells him that he can't leave them, and we see him clash swords with Wujin. Matsu says he'll claw his eyes out, and Wujin says he's all bark, no bite. But he notices the master swordsman's sword from the Messiah Guild, and he tells Matsu he sees that he's the master's disciple. Matsu is surprised and asks how he knew. Jae-hoon looks around, looking for Young's men, saying Wujin isn't the problem, and just the four of them clearing the dungeon isn't a problem. But Stinky tells him to focus up on the fight, and asks for help. Jae-hoon realizes that if Young's men appear now, they will be wiped out. It cuts back to Matsu asking how he knew, and Wujin says it seems like as if the master is losing his senses, making Matsu a disciple. He angrily attacks Wujin, and Wujin is glad that he's falling for the provocations, but says it'll be hard to beat him with just his sword, then bites his lip. Matsu swipes at him, and he leaps into the air to avoid it, then spits blood into his face, hitting Matsu in the eyes. This angers him, and he realizes he's been poisoned, and that if this fight drags on, it will be bad for him, and he tells Wujin he will end the fight now. He begins to imbue his sword with mana, and Wujin recognizes the attack as a skill only those chosen by a certain nimbus can use. Matsu puts his sword in front of his face, then slashes toward Wujin. Wujin watches, and we see a large amount of dust gets brought up. Matsu says his body is getting tired, but realizes he was meant to bring Wujin back alive. Wujin quickly attacks him from behind, and Matsu wonders how he avoided the attack, and then he gets sliced like a pizza. As he's dying, he recalls his teachings by the master, and how he can only use the ability once, and the master tells him while his copy of the skill is good, it's too much for him to use in a real fight, and he needs to refrain from using it against someone who recognizes the skill. And if he ever meets someone unharmed after being hit with the skill, he will be caught and killed by that monster. As he's dying, he tells his teacher he ran into that monster today. Stinky yells out for him, and then gets tail swiped, and lands into a tree, and falls down. Jae-hoon says they are all useless, and that even Young's group hasn't appeared, so they cannot win. He tells Woojin to call it a truce, and they don't need to fight, and they should conquer the dungeon together, or else they'll die to the lizard man. Woojin smirks, saying he doesn't need to worry about that and that killing everyone will make it easier for him to clear the dungeon. Jae-hoon, nervous, asks what he means. We watch as the Skelly boys crawl from the floor, and there are quite a few of them now. Woojin says that he can't trust Jae-hoon since he wanted him dead a few minutes ago. Jae-hoon realizes it wasn't only the blood poison skill, and turns around to see the lizard man biting at him. He dodges backward, but gets swiped by the tail, but it is blocked by Stinky, and he barks at Jae-hoon for not helping him earlier. The tail coils around him like a snake, and lifts him into the air. Stinky tells him to move his face away, and ironically tells the lizard that he stinks. And it snaps him like a twig. Jae-hoon realizes he isn't going to make it out alive. It cuts a little, and he is surprised by the skeleton's movements, and how it's almost like a high-level player, and that there are 5 of them. And he realizes if Woojin is this strong, then Young's group is dead. And now the confusion on how the edgelords all died in the previous dungeon has now been answered by this, but he needs to try and escape to write a report on this. But he is confused as to why the lizard man is ignoring the skeletons, and just tunnel visioned on him. One of the skelly bones runs beside the lizard man and cuts its leg, causing it to fall onto the floor. It's now inflicted with blood poison. Jae-hoon wonders if they beat it, and watches as the lizard man stands back up, and looks at one of the skelly bones, but quickly turns its head back to him. He's devastated because it's like the skeletons are invisible, and the chase ensues again. Woojin says it's easier for him now that he's distracting the lizard man, and while he probably doesn't understand, and he recalls some past memories. We see one of his old party members asking if she really has to spread this mud on her body, and the tank tells her yes, and asks Woojin if it's right, and he tells them that's not it. The flashback ends, and he wonders if they are doing well, and Jae-hoon is still running for his life, and realizes he can't keep doing this. Since the lizard man is only targeting players, he dashes toward Woojin, saying he won't suffer alone. Woojin watches, and one of the skeletons stand in his way, and Jae-hoon leaps over it, but doesn't see the second and gets cut down his face. He falls to his knees, and the lizard man doesn't miss this chance, and Dolphin dives toward him. Munching his leg, Woojin just watches as Jae-hoon cries about his leg, and he looks over to see the skeletons atop the lizard man, and is glad they killed it. Woojin starts walking at him, thanking him for distracting the lizard man, but now they need to wrap things up. Jae-hoon tells him to wait, and to talk about it first, and Woojin says he should say that to the guy behind him, and points to the lizard man. And says he's probably curious as to why it's only focusing on him, and Woojin explains that its eyes work as a heat sensor, so he isn't even interested in the skeletons. It leaps at him again. It cuts to the news, and we see a new dungeon was discovered, with a boss called the Needle Snake, and multiple guilds rejected going into the dungeon. We see Yongwon's secretary telling him this is terrible timing, and that it couldn't be any worse. Because now the public opinion of the Phoenix Guild is horrible. Yongwon says it's irrelevant, and now they need to focus on the 6th floor dungeon. We see the Messiah Guild publicly announce that they'll delay their raid of the dungeon, and second comments on how even the Messiah Guild is afraid of it. The other man, who still isn't named yet, says the Needle Snake is named the Snake of Death, because there hasn't been a single player who has hunted it yet. So anything that discusses this boss is useless. Second is contemplating on why such a dangerous monster has appeared, and wonders if the Messiah Guild has any ulterior motives for their announcement. And he realizes something, and asks the other man what he thinks will happen if every guild delays entering the dungeon. The other guy says that only those without fear would gather, and when time passes, the government would also want it to be cleared, and second says exactly. And that the dungeon will be conquered on a broader scale, and then asks what happens when someone defeats the Needle Snake, and the guy replies that they would become famous. Then realizes the guys from the Messiah Guild are trying to buy more time. Second says he's not certain, but there's gotta be a reason they are delaying it, and that there will also be a lot of items without an owner in the dungeon too, so when the Needle Snake dies, they will obtain fame and wealth. It cuts back to a notification saying you've obtained the achievement of Lizard Warrior Hunter, and we see the skeleton boys atop the lizard man's corpse, and he's gained more authority. Woojin says things ended faster than he thought, and since he's gotten involved with the Messiah Guild now, it'll be difficult for him to move freely, and we see he's gotten Matsu's weapon now too. and hands it off to one of the skeletons saying he can use it, and it looks at its own face through the blade, and Woojin decides it's time to read Matsu's memories. It cuts to outside, and we see someone screaming the dungeon has been cleared, and one of the managers run up, asking Woojin where the others are, and he says they are dead. The guy asks what he means, and to explain it. Woojin says to just write the boss was strong. Woojin heads inside his trailer, and answers a phone call saying it went as Youngwon predicted, and that one of the guys targeting him had a unique sword that the master swordsman used. And since he's an important member of the Messiah Guild, he's sure the Yamato faction is part of the main branch of the Skull Guild. He looks at the TV and notices something, and says other than that, there's nothing he could find out, and says he'll contact them again as he leaves the trailer. We see the TV was recording him, and he turns around and smirks while leaving, and it cuts to a flashback of Matsu talking about a bug that has been installed, which is from the memories Woojin got from him. And now that Skull Guild will fall for their own trap, and he's curious as to what they'll do to Youngwon. He receives a call from Youngwon, and he tells Woojin he heard about what happened, and asks if he has anything to report. Woojin says he couldn't find much out, but he knows where a branch of the Skull Guild is at. Youngwon tells him to come to his house and tell him, and they agree to meet. Woojin gets in his car, and it cuts to him at a station, opening a locker, and he's curious if Second knows he's a target too, and he hopes the dungeon list isn't disappointing. It skips to after he's read it, and he says it makes sense as to why the Messiah Guild is trying to eliminate him, because there's such high quality content in here. And most of these dungeons he conquered with Messiah in his past life, and now he realizes Second wasn't targeted for nothing. He's surprised to see that Second has a specific dungeon, because there's not much information about the dungeon reward, and he wonders what's inside of the egg the reward. But decides he can find out for himself, because previously, only Sejin knew about it, and now he needs to be the one to clear this dungeon. He walkie-talkies Second, and Second is glad it's time for their first deal. It cuts to Woojin at Youngwon's house, and we learn he's told Youngwon that Young and the Skull Guild died fighting each other. Woojin tells him one of the edgelords was strong, and based on their style and equipment, they have a connection to Japan. Youngwon says there are a couple of important factions there, and he'll look into the issue, and we see on the news he's publicly announced his attack on the 6th floor dungeon. He tells Woojin that the Skull Guild will continue to watch over him, and to refrain from acting alone. And snaps his finger for his secretary Kim to tell him that she's deposited the money into Woojin's account. Youngwon tells him he'll contact him again after he clears this dungeon. Woojin leaves, and smirks while saying when he's back, because now they will be targeting Youngwon, rather than him. And he's looking forward to seeing Youngwon's reaction in the future, and he wonders if he should go against Youngwon's warnings. It cuts to a trailer outside a gate, and Secretary Lee is telling Second she doesn't know if Woojin will agree to their situation, and Second tells her not to worry. We hear her tell a man named Lee Jinna to get ready, and he tells Secretary Lee not to call his name, and we hear Woojin listening to their conversation from outside. He recognizes the name as a Phoenix Guild member, and opens the door, and we see it's the man who's always with Second. Secretary Lee tells her that Jinna will accompany him, and if he agrees to go ahead and sign the contract, and she'll answer any questions he has. We learn that Jinna is considered immortal, and how when he was a Messiah hunting dog, Jinna escaped from him twice, but there wasn't a third chance. Woojin says it's his first time hearing about an examiner, and confirms they need to enter the dungeon together, and then says Jinna's name, which angers him. Because he hates his name, and he makes a comment about it. Woojin apologizes, but sarcastically calls him Mr. Jinna barks at him, and Woojin asks if he can talk to Second, and Secretary Lee tells him the walkie-talkie will reach him. He asks Second if he can hear him, and Second asks if there's an issue. Second asks if there's a problem with the examiner, and Woojin says that's not it, and questions about what happens if Jinna dies. Jinna wonders if he's being threatened, and Second says he won't need to worry, and Woojin says he understands. Jinna stands over him, and grabs the walkie-talkie telling Second that their new client is crazy. And if they enter the gate and he's not as expected, he'll eliminate him. Second gets angry, and then they start to banter again about calories and food like they usually do. Secretary Lee thankfully stops them, and says she'll guide them to the entrance, and as they are walking, Jinna tells Woojin not to try and pull anything. Because he isn't merciful to those who try to attack him, and he's never let anyone off the hook before. Woojin realizes he isn't bluffing based on his past life, and he's glad he ran into the immortal Jinna so early, and says he's going to be of good use. It cuts to Secretary Lee on the phone asking Second if everything will be alright, and what if Jinna doesn't return. Second says if that happens, Woojin will be their enemy. They enter the gate, and Jinna asks if he's glad he's pissed him off, because he'll do his best ignoring him. And he wonders how Woojin will catch all of the dire wolves by himself because he will sit here and watch until he's begged to help. He sits down, and tells Woojin to get moving, and Woojin stares at him. Jinna begins to pig out on some food, and says if Woojin asks for forgiveness, he will help him. Woojin then describes about Jinna's blessing, and how it's a legendary skill, that even if he lost his head, or had his heart ripped out, he would not die. Woojin says he's probably thinking he's lucky to be immortal. Woojin summons a skeleton while saying that now he's met Woojin, Jinna will understand that it was just a delusion that he thinks he's We see Mr. Skelly Bones kill a mob, and Jinna tells Woojin his cutie is good at fighting, and asks for its name and gives it a bad nickname. Woojin ignores him, and Jinna says he understands now how he was able to clear a dungeon by himself. We see a horde of dead monsters under Mr. Skelly Bones, and Jinna is sweating nervously, because the skeleton has the skill of a high-level player. And it's scary that he can summon more than one skeleton, so it would be dangerous to be Woojin's enemy, and he should tell Second about him when he's done. Woojin asks him how it was, and Jinna says he doesn't think Woojin will need his help, and that he'll tell Second about this when he's done. Woojin informally tells him K, and Jinna asks if he heard him correctly, because it sounded informal. He stands up and looks over to watch as the skeletons form, and then he sees he's surrounded by them, and asks Woojin what he's doing, and he realizes there are 5. Woojin says that didn't Jinna tell him earlier he was planning to sit back and watch if he didn't beg him. Jinna tells him it was just a joke, and that he didn't mean to offend him. He takes a step forward, then dashes and swings at Woojin, calling him a bastard. Woojin smirks, then shoulder throws Jinna. Junna looks up to see Woojin telling him it was a good idea to attack the summoner. Then Jinna realizes that Woojin predicted all of this, and has been hiding his skills, and wonders what his real goal is. Jinna tells him he won't get anything out of him, and that he's good at keeping secrets. Woojin replies by saying it doesn't look like he is, and it doesn't matter anyway. The skeletons all put their swords to his head, and then it cuts to Jinna tied up and hanging from a tree, yelling to be untied. And he asks him how long it has been, and if he's planning to starve him. Woojin cuts the rope, and Jinna falls to the floor. Woojin tells him to prepare himself, and Jinna is confused. Woojin says he's shown him his skills, and now it is his turn. Jinna asks him what the hell he's saying, and Woojin says that he needs to be bait so the skeletons can attack easily. Jinna asks if he thinks he'll listen to him, and Woojin pulls up the rope and asks if he should hang him up again. Jinna realizes he's crazy, then says that he's right and he has a great tank. It cuts to Jinna running, and turning one of the wolves into Kool-Aid. The rest begin to jump atop him, and he says there's too many of them, and they dogpile on him. His arm raises out of the dogpile, then falls down. We see a skeleton shadow loom over one of the wolves, and it turns around to see my skelly bones, and then the onslaught ensues. In an extremely brutal fashion, they annihilate the dogs, and then we see Jinna yelling and knocking the rest of them away. Woojin watches, as Jinna cleans up the rest of the wolves, and Jinna is clearly tired, and he looks over at Woojin. Woojin says while it's not the same as in the past, he still won't die as easily, so he will be useful in the future. We see Woojin running, and Jinna says it's crazy because Woojin isn't giving him a break at all, and there's a horde of wolves behind him. We see the wolves getting diffed by the Skelly boys, and Jinna sees one left as it's biting his leg. He pets it, and gently throws it to one of the skeletons. It smiles the best it can, and a clear message appears. Jinna tells the Skelly boys they are being overworked, and met the wrong master, and unlike Woojin, they are working hard. And offers them a high five. One of them contemplates it and then turns his head away. Jinna angry. He goes to put his hand on its head, and it avoids. Woojin watches this and realizes Jinna is different than he was in his past life, a man with a powerful body who fought against the Messiah Guild, and that he was one of the strongest men he's acknowledged. His style was giving up his flesh to land hits, and Woojin had a hard time against him. But currently, there is no anger in him, so there must have been a trigger that made him that way. And he thinks maybe Second's death is the trigger. And if Second lives, the Messiah Guild will have their plan ruined. Jinna looks over at Woojin and says he may not know his intentions, but Woojin lured the perfect amount of mobs so that Jinna wouldn't be overpowered, and it was multiple times. So it wasn't just a coincidence, and that it's scary how quickly he's gauged this. Jinna admits that Woojin is superior to him, and Woojin says it's time for the next floor, which confuses Jinna, and Woojin says it's a much better floor than this one. They head to the second floor, and Jinna says he's so tired he thought he would die, and asks if they can take a break. Woojin pulls some vials of blood out of his storage, and Jinna asks what they are for. Woojin asks if he's good at running, and Jinna is confused. Then Woojin throws the blood onto the floor around Jinna, and tells him he better start running. They hear a sound in the forest, and Jinna turns around to see a giant lizard emerge from the tree line, and calls Woojin evil. It cuts to Second reading the news, and we see his predictions were accurate, and he wonders how many foreign guilds will appear for the raid. Secretary Lee tells him that she'll analyze the list she's got. Second says good, and they still have time before Juna returns, and she asks if he'll be okay. It cuts back to Jinna booking it, and wondering how he is the only one being hunted down, and we see the skeletons running behind the giant lizard. Jinna realizes he's meant to act as bait, and then stops running to confront the lizard. And he wonders how this is better than the first dungeon, and threatens Woojin. We see him blocking the lizard's attack, causing him to slide, and Woojin continues to watch from a tree. It goes back to Jinna, and we see he's managed to stop the giant lizard, and tells it that it's time to stop dragging it on, and we see one of the skeletons leaping into the air behind the lizard, and then a second, and they stab it, inflicting it with poison blood. It falls to the floor, and Jinna comments on how the skeletons have been trained well, and how normally they are just used as support. The lizard stands back up and swipes at the skeletons, and one duck under it, and the others leap into the air. It looks at the skeletons, eyeballing them up for a minute, and then looks around, and Jinna realizes it can't see them, and realizes it's why he's the only one being chased. He wonders how Woojin knew all of this, and then Jinna realizes it was all planned from the start. He gets hit by the lizard, and yelps as he gets sent flying through trees, knocking them down as he crashes through them. The dust settles, and he stands back up, and heals completely. Woojin says it's as expected, and he watches Jinna do a JoJo pose to the lizard, who is drooling excessively. Jinna says it's a waste of his calories, and equips knuckle weapons from his inventory, and then dashes toward the lizard. He gets close and rears his fist back, then launches a flurry of attacks onto it, essentially dead-legging the lizard. It falls, and the skeletons quickly approach it from behind, and Jinna watches as they continue using him as bait, and they stab the lizard's sides, causing it to roar, as it's inflicted with poison again. One of them leaps through the air, and lands on its think tank, landing the finishing blow. It falls, and Jinna lets out a sigh. Woojin hops down from the tree, and we see a ton of status windows appearing about level ups, and how his skills have ranked up, and he's gained more authority. Woojin smirks, and then it cuts to some Ben 10 monster getting ganged up on by some dripped out skeletons. They manage to take it to the floor, and begin killing it. And a hooded man says the skeletons are stupid, and that he needs to summon more. We see it's his 50th troll kill, but the Nimbus is ignoring him, and he wonders who is being noticed by the Nimbus. It cuts back to Woojin and Jinna is hungry, so he tells him they should leave, unless there's more to do. Woojin says they still have the most important thing left. Woojin begins to run his fingers across the lizard's abdomen and talks to himself, asking if it's here, and then slices it open, and we see him open the stomach and reaches inside to reveal an egg. And that the Messiah Guild hid whatever is inside of this, and now he'll find out what it is. Jinna mentions how the clear condition of the dungeon was to secure something, and asks what he's going to do with the item. Woojin cracks it, and Jinna yells, asking what he's doing. The shell continues to crumble, and we see it glowing like, and he looks inside to see a skill page, and he shakes that they killed people over just this. And we see it's a skill page for his class, and it makes him immune to all poison types. He wonders how the King of Deadly Poison's skill is here, and how brutal the man is with killing people, and that the Messiah Guild lost many of their members trying to kill him, and he gets angry thinking about it all. And he realizes that it would have been impossible that the Poison King stole this from the Messiah Guild, so they must have given it to him so he could be a villain, and they could be the saviors. Which means all of his allies' deaths were useless, but now he's obtained it, their deaths won't be repeated. He learns the skill, and states again that he will be the one to kill Sejin. Jinna watches and wonders why he's in such a lousy mood, and that they aren't fit to be a duo. We see them exit the dungeon, and they head into their trailer and see a bag on the table. Jinna thinks it's food, and runs over to it only to see walkie-talkies, and water. Second hears the walkie-talkie, and says they finished faster than he thought, and asks them how the dungeon was. Woojin says it was fine, and asks if anything happened, and Second says that Yongwan's group is unreachable, and that some foreign guilds have joined the raid, and that a man caught a golden dragon. Woojin recognizes it, and mentions how the scales were used for armor as they have a high heat resistance, but it was really the dragon's juice that changed the world, and while he's unsure of the actual uses, it can be used to remove seals/curses, and that even Sejin's sword was unsealed using it. And that he needs to obtain it before people figure this out. Second asks if there's anything else he wants to know, and Woojin says that's enough. Second asks to speak with Jinna, and says he'll give Woojin a phone for later, then starts barking at Jinna, telling him to get back to the office already. Jinna says he should rest because he worked so hard, and Second mentions food, so, of course, Jinna, being the pig he is, instantly gets up. As he leaves, he wonders if he will have to stick around with Woojin in the future, and then he leaves. It cuts to the office, and we see Jinna asking Second why he called him here so early in the morning, and Second says it's because of the report he wrote, and tells him to read something. Jinna sees it's the Needle Snake Dungeon, and he asks if he's meant to go in alone, and Second tells him that he'll be going with someone skilled. Jinna then starts naming who it could be if Second is saying they are skilled, but he doesn't mention a certain someone. Second says he's forgetting about Woojin, and Jinna says he doesn't want to do it. And that he's a maniac without a sense of camaraderie, and his personality is evil, and if he has to work with him again, he'll go on hunger strike. Second says he'd be grateful for that, and he pulls out a recording of Jinna getting caught in 4K, admitting that he doesn't care about his comrades' personality if they are skilled. And Second asks if he remembers this. Jinna calls him cheap, and Second informs him he's already signed them up, and they've given the other guilds good bait. Jinna is confused. It cuts to a deserted building, and we see Woojin sharpening a sword, and he says he needs a proper workshop, and then opens a suitcase, surprised by an item Second gathered for him, and he's glad he gets to meet the edgelords again. It cuts back to Jinna and Second talking about if there are any spots left in the dungeon, and Second says he's already prepared it in advance with Secretary Lee. Jinna says won't it be hard for Woojin to participate, and asks if he's spending a lot of money. The door opens, and Second turns over and asks Secretary Lee if she's finished her work. She says yes, and that the bidding has finished, and she gave Woojin the item, and she's brought the masks he's asked for too. Second tells her good work, and we see the news discussing the raid. It cuts to the raid site, and we see behind the Moscow door Jinna is wearing a mask, saying it's uncomfortable, and then calls out to Woojin, who is going by Isaac Disguise, asking if he's okay. Woojin tells Jinna he's a fatty, and asks if he's nervous. Jinna says no while stuffing his mouth, while internally, he's having a breakdown wondering how Woojin is so calm. He then asks Woojin if he's nervous, to which he says of course. Jinna tells him to believe in him. Woojin goes through his inventory, saying he's glad he's got an item, and Jinna tells him to buy him meat after they finish, and that they need to fight together, so don't do anything weird like last time. We see the item is called the Grim Reaper's Mask, and it allows him to control the skeletons better, and increases his mana power, and recovery, and he didn't know he'd have the item. It cuts to him previously on the phone with Second, and when Second asks if he's thought about the Needle Snake Dungeon, and Woojin says it's dangerous. Second laughs, saying he knows, and tells him he's prepared a suitable item for him to help with controlling the Skelly boys, and it's a legendary rank. A man enters the room, telling them to prepare themselves, and Woojin says he needs to test the mask on the first floor. It cuts to everyone inside of the dungeon, and they see it's a survival quest, and everyone begins to panic. Jinna tells Woojin it seems simple, but surviving here will be hard, and asks Woojin what they will do. And he replies by saying they'll carry out their test. Jinna is shocked, then gets PTSD and asks Woojin if he didn't listen to him in the waiting room. Woojin says he just received a new item, so he needs to test its performance. Jinna claps, and says he's right, and he should test it. Woojin says they should go to a quiet place. We see him summon a skeleton, and Jinna greets it. And compliments the skeleton's drip, and begins playing with Mr. Skelly Bones. Woojin opens his inventory and pulls out the mask, and he opens his eyes and is surprised to see a string attached to the skeleton. And he wonders how to control it, and he reaches out and touches the string, and feels it begin to run through his nerves, and is now connected. He sees a flashing light, then opens his eyes to see Jinna. Jinna pats his head, saying he's acting weird, and Woojin tells him to get his hands off him. Jinna flips out, and the skeleton begins to move awkwardly, and then falls over. Jinna asks if it's dead, and then kicks its head. Woojin tells him to move his foot away, and he realizes controlling the skeleton is harder than he thought. We see some people asking a man named Youngjun what his plan is, and we learn they are from the Hidi Guild, and he tells them they should move carefully. And they'll stay here for a few days and see what everyone else does, because a larger group increases their odds of survival. They see everyone else, and wonder if they also thought the same thing, and that since nobody else has as much authority as the Messiah Guild, and they need to persuade others so their guild could focus on hunting. It cuts back to Jinna, and he's punching an orc, sending its head flying. He wonders why he was worried because the numbers are all weak, and wonders if he got stronger. He hears the sound of slashes, and turns around to see one of the Skelly boys kill 2 orcs, and then he makes a perfectly normal face, and is Woojin with the criminally offensive side eye. And explains how he was struggling to walk, and he kept falling over. But now he's running around murdering orcs, and since they were already strong, this is just too much. He says it's unfair that he has to tank, while Woojin sits in the back and reaps the benefits. He looks over to see the small skeleton beside a giant one, and then realizes Woojin can summon them while controlling the skeletons. Woojin explains that it consumes a ton of mana, and he doesn't think he can use the blood poison skill. He asks Jinna through the skeleton how his condition is, and Jinna tells him to look him in the face when he's talking to him. And asks Woojin if he needs to be taught proper etiquette. Woojin asks if that's so, and appears behind him, asking if he prefers this. This scares Jinna, and he repeats his question about his condition. Jinna tells him he feels better, after teaching those without manners, and then says he didn't mean Woojin. Woojin asks if it's time to go out all out now, and Jinna says that he's been fighting crazy the entire time, and asks why they are going all out now, and asks about the orcs from before, and we see the skeletons behind Woojin. And he tells Jinna it was just a warm-up. Jinna begins to panic and says that his body doesn't feel good, and he says he's got anemia, then fakes being dizzy. One of the skeletons begin tapping his side with a sword, and Woojin answers by saying he'll inject iron into him, and Jinna says that's a sword, and Woojin tells him it's going into his body anyway. Woojin tells him to follow as he's got a plan. Jinna is angry he can't do anything to him. It cuts to a tree falling, and we see Woojin chopping trees, and Jinna wonders what he is thinking, because he's just been chopping trees instead of monsters. It cuts to day 2 of the dungeon, and we see some members of the Hidi Guild chasing some goblins, and they quickly take them out. And then day 3, it happens again, and one of the players say it's boring, and another one says it's strange that they are small mobs. Youngjun says they are being too relaxed, and they need to scout the area even if it's risky. We see a wall built from logs, and Woojin gets another reward from his Nimbus, and he sees that he's gotten a buff for the Skelly boys. He grins, and then tells Jinna it's time to move. Jinna asks why now, because they just worked hard to build this fort. Woojin says change of plans, and Jinna asks why. Woojin takes his mask off, and we see him summon more soldiers, and Jinna is shocked, and says wasn't he only able to summon 5? Woojin says that was before, but now it's different. It cuts to Youngjun, surprised, as they stumble onto a massive number of orc corpses. They wonder how many there are, and he wonders who could have done such a massacre, and wonders if he missed a skilled person. One of the men tells him to look over here, and there are more. And he asks what he means, and we see they've spotted a labyrinth, and we see it's all made out of wood, and he wonders if it was meant to lure the mobs and trap them. And just based on the sheer number of bodies, he wonders who planned this, because it's so unique, and then he realizes this is why they were able to relax even though it was a survival quest. And he decides to gather all of the leftover players. It cuts to Jinna, and he's telling Woojin that it's not his usual style to trap monsters, but it works, so whatever, and asks why they keep moving around so much. And asks if they'll need to make it again, and Woojin says no. Because now that their manpower is increased, the mazes are a waste of time, and it's faster to hunt them right away, while being surrounded by the boys. Jinna says he likes this, and now he can show off his skills. One of the skeletons point their sword at Jinna, and he tells them he just recovered from his anemia. Woojin tells him he'll take the lead. Jinna is fired up, and says he won't let him run in front of him. It cuts to Jinna tired, and he's asking Woojin if he can wait so that they can rest. One of the skeletons runs up to him and shakes their head, and this angers him, and he asks if he's making fun of him. He barks at it while it runs away, and he wonders how Woojin has so much stamina, and says their styles are so different. While Jinna is brawling, he runs out of stamina quickly, but Woojin just one-sidedly kills his enemy and escapes, and it's an efficient fighting style. And he wants to learn it too. Woojin turns around and asks Jinna what he meant by him going to show him his skills. Jinna wonders why he remembered that, and says he was about to show him. He charges into a group of kobolds, and decides to go all out. Woojin comments on how if he was the Jinna he knew, then he would show him the moves he saw earlier, and that nobody was able to guide him this far. So he puts a lot of trust into his body, and is inefficient in his fighting style, but says he'll become more useful as time passes, then says he will make sure he's useful. It cuts to day 5 in the dungeon, and we see a kobold's corpse, and a notification saying there's only 24 hours left for the quest. And Jinna wonders why he's going so far for a survival quest, and wonders if Woojin lost something to the monsters. Woojin's Nimbus gives him a reward, and Jinna yells, saying this is too much, and that he's not a machine. Woojin gives him a break, and Jinna is happy. It cuts to him eating, and he sees one of the skeletons, and asks if it wants food. He tells it to stick its hand out, and then is surprised when it does. He asks Woojin if he saw the skeleton, and that this is true camaraderie. He says he feels moved, and there's something that can't be explained about comrades, and when he goes to ask Woojin if he's hungry, he sees the skeleton handing him the food. And gets angry because he was the one controlling the skelly boy, and gets angry he was toying with him. Woojin says he wants to know what this so-called comradeship tastes like. And then they banter, and Jinna says that Woojin will turn bald like Second. Woojin is surprised to hear that, as it's his first time hearing about Second's appearance. They hear a rescue signal, and Jinna wonders what it's for, because they massacred a lot of monsters. Woojin tells him it isn't a rescue signal, and Jinna asks what it is. Woojin tells him that since they are going to the 2nd floor, they are deciding the order of the needle snake hunt. Jinna calls them arrogant, and Woojin says since they've made them feel comfortable over the last few days, they have gotten confident. Jinna says no way, and Woojin pulls out a gold skill, and Jinna is shocked. Woojin smiles, saying it was Georg's main skill, and we see the Skella boys can turn into little bombers. It cuts to Youngjun gathering all of the players, and he yells out to them, saying since most of them are here, he will tell them now. In a few minutes, they will move to the next floor, and that his alliance will try to hunt the snake first, and asks if there are any objections. Jinna says it's crazy that Woojin predicted this, and Woojin ignores him. Youngjun says since there aren't any objections, but he will warn everyone and don't interfere with their hunting, or else he will kill them. Woojin realizes it's a personal warning, and Jinna asks what his plan is now. A man pushes Jinna, asking if he didn't hear what was just said, and as he goes to beat the dude, Woojin stops him, and tells them good luck. Jinna asks why he stopped them, and Woojin asks if he is planning to fight them all. Woojin explains that they are all in an alliance based on their armbands, but of course, Jinna didn't notice. Jinna acts like he knew about it, and he realizes there's nobody without a band. He asks if they have a chance, and Woojin asks what he thinks. They move to the 2nd floor, and we see Clifford, the giant snake roaming through the forest, and some players are hiding behind the trees, waiting to strike. Some are very nervous, and then as it approaches another group, Youngjun yells, telling the men to fire. We see they launch magic attacks at the snake, and it screams as a massive explosion erupts in its face. Jinna asks Woojin if he's just going to watch, because they might catch it. Woojin says nah, no shot. Jinna asks why, and Woojin asks him what's the first thing he'd do when he encounters a mob, and Jinna says he'd try to jab it, but he won't go all out. Woojin says exactly, and asks if Jinna would punch the snake. Jinna sweats, then says of course, because getting rid of it with manpower is good. Woojin agrees, but says if it were an easy task, someone would have cleared the dungeon already. Then asks why he thinks they failed. Youngjun tells everyone to proceed, and the snake begins to run away from them, and Youngjun does the Nerge glasses thing and says it's just a matter of time until they catch it, and he'll be the first to kill it. We see the snake begins to grow needles out of its head, and it rams headfirst into some rock formations that appeared out of the ground, and it begins to recoil around on the floor. Jinna says it seems like they've prepared everything, And Woojin tells him the real fight starts now, and that the snake hasn't ever attacked properly. And asks if he thinks its hair is weird. Youngjun continues his attack on the snake, and we see them hitting it directly. One of the men notices a shadow looming over his head, and then sees the tail coming down and smacks them all, creating a wall of dust. When the dust fades, we see the man from a second ago is fine, and a wall of shieldmen saved him. He decides to finish the attack, and everyone resumes firing onto it. Youngjun tells his men to charge in, and we see them rushing toward the snake. It goes straight into the air, and then expands, and we see the giant spikes expand. Youngjun goes to warn his men, but it's too late as the needles fly out from the snake, landing all around the players, but not hitting them, and the snake lets out a roar. Woojin says it's like he thought. Jinna is surprised by the attack, and we see the snake created a ring around itself. Youngjun wonders if that was all, and says he thought something was up, but the attack wasn't strong. One of the men pushes the needle over and sees they break very easily, and that the inside of empty. Youngjun yells out that the snake has no needles, and to attack before it recovers. And they all rush in, and again the nerd does the glasses push, saying it's no big deal. One of the players sees someone stopped, and asks what he is doing. Then notices he spits out a ton of blood, and collapses. And then more begin to collapse, and then they realize poison is everyone, and they tell Youngjun this, and that almost all of their troops can't continue. He wonders how it happened, then realizes it was the needles. And if all of the tankers have fallen, it's deadly. We see a Skeleboy hanging out in a tree, and Woojin is creepin'. He says it's gruesome, and Jinna asks him what's going on. Woojin informs him, and Jinna wonders how they were poisoned. Jinna asks if they'll join everyone else, and Woojin says no, we know it's trump card now, so it's time to move. Jinna asks if he's crazy. Woojin tells him he'll go alone, and to wait here and prep himself. Jinna says that's a relief, and says he's not here to be ordered around, and Woojin jokingly tells him he can go to the needle snake then. Jinna tries to play it off like it isn't what he meant. The snake stands back up, whipping its tail around, and we see Woojin beside the snake and says the poison is very stealthy, and now he understands how they all fell for it. And by the time they noticed, it was too late. But he's different from them, and we see his poison resistance activates, and he smirks, by the fact when his poison resistance is activated, his own poison is strengthened. He sees a spear, and comes up with some plan, but doesn't say what. We see Youngjun realizing he messed up, and asks how many people escaped, and one of the men say maybe 30, but they need to go back and get the rest, to which he replies no, and they are probably dead. The other man argues, saying they need tankers, and Youngjun tells him they'll lose more by doing that, and he's given up on winning. Everyone is angry that they can't go back in, and Youngjun thinks that fighting without a tank is just suicide, and that he needs to remain calm. They hear the sound of the snake, and begin to panic. Youngjun tells a scout to find its location quickly, and he tells them that it's currently fighting a player. Everyone is surprised, and Youngjun says it makes no sense, because who can breathe through the poison? Everyone watches in awe, and wonder who is fighting the snake, and how they are doing it. Youngjun wonders if the poison has faded, and realizes there might be people still alive, and tells his men they should go back for the survivors. One of his men asks if he's crazy, and he tells them the poison should be gone, and they won't get another chance. We see the snake gets hit by 2 arrows, and he sees the Skelleboys firing at him. Woojin says it's as he thought, and the arrow can't pierce through its skin. But he can avoid the skin by poisoning it. He rushes up its side with spears in hand, and the boys keep shooting it. The snake hisses and dashes straight at them, and they dodge its attack. Woojin uses this chance to leap from its side and then twirls his spear as he stabs twice. The snake has been poisoned and turns around quickly to see him. And he says since the needles are gone, there are many holes in its body. Seuss, and he decides to poison the holes. And since it's like a human's pore, it must be painful. He taunts it, and it charges at him, and he explains that the poison comes from the holes after the needles are gone. He throws a spear at the snake's eye, hitting it directly, inflicting it with poison again. The snake recoils all over the place, and Woojin dashes away, and says it cries a lot for a giant, and wonders how it likes being poisoned. It cuts to Jinna moving orc corpses, and he wonders why Woojin wanted him to do such a weird task, and it makes him angry just thinking about it. And when he curses Woojin, he replies to him through a skeleton and scares Jinna. He asks Jinna if he's prepared everything like he was asked. Jinna says yes and asks if the snake will really come here. Woojin tells him to finish quickly, and while Jinna barks, he disconnects from the connection. Woojin says that, now that the preparation has been finished, decides it's time to start and connects to one of the skeletons, which is hacking away at the snake. We see him drop his sword, and turn around to see a bunch of spears coated in blood. He grabs one in each hand, and rushes at the snake, quickly bouncing off the trees and flying through the air, like it's Attack on Titan. He lands on the snake, impaling it with the spears, causing it to screech. The snake turns around to see Skeleboy, and Woojin disconnects from it, and we see it attack the skeleton, but another one quickly comes from the sky and lands on it again, repeating the process. As the snake falls, Woojin says he'll make it fit the name of Needle Snake. We see he continues just stabbing it with blood-coated spears, and he speaks through a skeleton, explaining that the poison took a while due to the large frame of the snake. He eats a spear at it, and then connects to a Skeleboy on the snake and catches the spear out of the air, and then lands on the snake, stabbing it. The snake's stats begin to decrease considerably, and it lets out a roar, and the Skeleboys hold onto their spears the best they can, as they rodeo this bad boy. The one Woojin is controlling leaps off and grabs a tree, and comments on how the snake is running away, and he smirks. We see the snake running straight over the pile of corpses from before, and Woojin explodes the corpses using his skill, creating a giant explosion, and causing the snake to rock backward, but it shakes off the explosion, and begins to run in the opposite way. We see it running to another group of bodies, and as it's right over them, it looks down and explodes again. Its stats decrease considerably again. It cuts out of the dungeon, and we see that the Phoenix Guild's raid has failed, and Second says it's the end of Youngwon's elite group, and that he's probably going to have his pride hurt. He tells Secretary Lee to prepare a car for the Needle Snake raid. She asks why when they still have a week. And he tells her he didn't spend a lot of money for nothing. She says since they are in disguise, they shouldn't get a trashy car. And that she'll prepare a diplomatic car immediately. He goes to tell her to wait, by asking a question, and she quickly answers and closes the door. It cuts back to the raid. We see Jinna watches all of the explosions, and Jinna finally realizes how much Woojin has predicted in this raid, and the snake coils up. Woojin approaches it with the boys, and it hisses at him, and he says it's too late. Another arrow hits it, and it turns around, but then gets hit on the other side. This repeats, and he tells the snake to stop trying to dodge. Because the longer this goes on, the more it'll hurt. Youngjun says he's been hearing the nasty screams for a while, and wonders who is fighting the snake. A message appears, saying the snake has been defeated, and everyone is shocked by it. The players begin to realize they can leave, and Youngjun is in disbelief. He says it doesn't matter, and they didn't come here for no results, and he needs to see his face at least. Woojin gains more authority from his Nimbus, and we see he gained a buff from being the first to kill the snake, and his skills have all ranked up. The exit forms, and a status window tells him to retrieve the pearl inside the snake. And he says it's troublesome. As Youngjun approaches, Jinna yells at him in English to stop. They wonder why he's blocking the road, and Youngjun tells him they aren't bad people and approach him, but quickly sees the boys got Jinna's back. He says that since they weren't affected by the poison, they are effective, but it doesn't add up because there's no way his attack failed, but some skeletons could have done it. And he says he needs to confirm the snake's corpse first. They hear a roar, and then everyone panics, and they all look up to see the snake's corpse turns into a skeleton after Woojin tells it to arise. Youngjun is shocked, and Jinna realizes he's making it a soldier. Youngjun rushes in to go see Woojin's face, but Jinna clotheslines him, and sends him flying backward. And then tells him he said to stay back. Youngjun tells everyone to remember his face. It cuts back to Woojin, and we see a glowing orange pearl inside of the skeleton, and then a message appears saying his rank is too low to turn Clifford into a Skelleboy, and he shatters to the floor, creating a wall of dust. It fades, and we see Woojin holding the yellow dragon's magic orb. We see it has some huge effects. It cuts to outside, and we see a reporter in a van wondering if the attack failed on the snake because it's been a week. The other guy says nobody expected it to succeed, and wishes it would end quickly so he can leave. They hear the dungeon has been cleared, and quickly run out of their car, and they are shocked. The reporters begin swarming the gate, asking who is in charge of it. And Youngjun is all suited up, asking where his support team is, and he tells them to stop the Russians because they killed the snake. One of them point to our boys, and we see they are dripped out, and everyone is going crazy about it, but 3 men stop the reporters from pestering them as they get into their car. Young Jun goes to grab the tag, but sees it's a diplomatic car, and realizes there's nothing he can do. Inside the car, Jin-ah wonders how much money Second spent on it, and Woojin takes his Isaac mask off. Jin-ah does too, and asks about the orb, and he should at least tell him about it since he worked so hard. Woojin gets a phone call and answers it, and we see Second asking how it feels to be a hero, and Woojin says he doesn't know, and asks how the image is. Second tells him that the media is paying a lot of news to him, and says it'd be a waste to throw his reputation away. And that if they increase the value of Isaac, they can play him on a bigger stage. Woojin realized it'd be useful to use the name to get into certain dungeons, and was going to propose the idea first, so he just agrees. Second tells him something interesting happened, and asks if he knows about Yongwan's personal guards, specifically Jin Hae-mi, and he tells him that her entire team was jungle diffed. And it's not unusual for a player to die in a dungeon, so it doesn't seem special, but it seems like there was a spy from the Skull Guild in her party. Woojin asks why he's telling him this, and Second says he's well aware of Woojin's relationship with Yongwan, and the Edgelords. And Woojin realizes Second isn't an ordinary person. It cuts to the car stopping, and Woojin tells Jin-ah to get out, and of course, he thinks it's about food, and Woojin tells him they are swapping cars. And he makes a goofy face. Inside of the car, he's barking because it's cramped, and he insults the car, asking who would drive this trash, and Woojin says it's his car. He quickly begins to praise the car, and Woojin tells him there's a fee for meals inside the glove box, and he can have it. Jin-ah is really excited, then sees it's just a few coins and is emotionally obliterated. We see all over the news that everyone is asking about Isaac, and Young Jun did some dumb interview, lying about Isaac, and everyone in the comments flame Isaac for assaulting him. Secretary Lee informs Second that everyone went from curious to angry about it all, and asks if they should do one too, and Second says yeah, and they need to reply properly. We see Woojin did an interview as Isaac, and how he says he's always admired the Messiah Guild, and that Sejin is his idol. Which quickly makes everyone change their opinion of Isaac. Woojin compliments Second's ability to manipulate everyone, and now realizes the Messiah Guild may try to recruit Isaac, and it never occurred to him this would happen, and he wants to see their reply. He gets a notification, and sees Yongwan cleared the 6th floor dungeon, and smirks. It cuts to Yongwan getting pictures taken of him, and his secretary runs up and tells him about Jin Hae-mi's group. He changes moods quickly, and ends the press conference, saying he needs a medical checkup, and angrily walks away. We see in the car his secretary informs him of what happened, and he asks if they can trust the information. She says it seems to all add up, and Yongwan is angry that there's a rat in his elite group, and that the Skull Guild has screwed them over. It cuts to the Messiah Guild, and they are debating on how to deal with Yongwan. Shinhai suggests leaving him to the public, and the Swordmaster says he's working with the Skull Guild to try and get rid of the mess. Shinhai tells him to stop acting reckless, and asks about the Lizard Warrior dungeon, and tells him to do his job properly. Because even Jae-hoon is probably dead, and asks if he's trying to make their relationship to the Skull Guild public. And she says they can't work with the Skull Guild anymore, and to stop any business with them. The swordsman tells her they can't do that, and it's not her decision. She tells him he's misunderstanding, and it is the master's decision. Awkward stares ensue. We see the master swordsman and archer talking about how it's time to split up from the Messiah Guild. It cuts to Woojin talking to Yongwan about his elite group that got killed, and that it's a surprise it happened. Yongwan tells him to cut the shit, and to speak honestly. He tells Woojin they need to annihilate the Skull Guild. We get a short backstory on how Yongwan is ambitious, and a few years from now, he'll sell all of his items and go into exile, because he is afraid of the Messiah Guild. Woojin says he'll become his guard, and tells him it seems like he's trying to use him, but he has no intention of being thrown away. Yongwan is surprised, because he didn't think this idea would come up, and decides it doesn't matter what his intention is. He accepts the idea, and asks Woojin if he'll hunt the Skull Guild down for his protection, and Woojin says yes. Yongwan is happy with the news, and Woojin leaves. And he's glad that Yongwan will be responsible for everything that comes next. It cuts to Woojin signing a contract to become part of Yongwan's royal guards, and when he exits the room, they wonder how Woojin got the position, since he just started. And the other man says he doesn't know, But Yongwon isn't the type to act without reason. In the elevator, we see people talking about how a traitor got into the royal guards, and the others mock how Woojin got into the royal guards, saying he must be sucking up, and is just lucky. Woojin thinks to himself his luck is good, but it doesn't matter, because the hunting is about to begin. We see Second receiving a call from Woojin, and he makes some small talk, then is surprised that Woojin wants a fake id. Jinna wonders what he's planning, and Second tells him that it isn't something he can't do, but it's difficult to manipulate dungeon managers, but he'll prep it ASAP. Second then tells Jinna they'll find out soon enough. Jinna asks why he's helping him without knowing the plan, and asks if he trusts him that much. Second tells him that he doesn't believe in people, and he's just trying to find out his loyalty, so they can find out if he'll betray them or not, since desires do not lie. It cuts to the Baberager from the Messiah meetings, talking to one of his lackeys about Woojin going to war with the Skull Guild because of Yongwon. And many of the Skull Guild members are entering the same dungeon as Woojin, but Woojin may have a fake ID now. The crybaby says he doesn't care about any of that, as long as he's in the dungeon. It cuts to Woojin arriving at the Incheon dungeon, and when they ask for his name, he tells them it's Lee Jong-yun. He signs some stuff, and they give him a brief, and he sees that the dungeon is low ranked, but has a high capacity. He realizes it's an obvious trap to lure him out, and then he gets blinded by some headlights and watches as people exit their cars. He recognizes one of the men as the crybaby Yang Ji-hoo. It cuts to Second, and he's wondering why he's participating in the raid, and Secretary Lee, and she informs him that he's entered under an alias. Second asks if it's the same dungeon as Woojin, and Jinna asks who Ji-hoo is. Second says he's a troublesome guy, and is part of the round table, and they are screwed. It cuts to Ji-hoo the crybaby, and Woojin recognizes him, and conveniently explains that the round table is a group of players with legendary items related to King Arthur. They exist to protect those on behalf of the government, just like the Messiah Guild. And over time, the round table became weak, and became Shinhei's guards, and this was all their scheme, and the Poison King was the one who weakened them. Woojin mentions how the necklace that Ji-hoo possesses was taken from the original owner, but it's still a dangerous item regardless of who owns it, so there's no need to hold back. Skella boys get a quick buff, and then a man shouts that everyone will be entering the dungeon. Inside the dungeon, we see the clear condition is to kill 3,000 mobs, and some of the players are complaining about it. One of the men tells Ji-hoo it's not dangerous, but it might take a while. Ji-hoo says it's a good chance to find where Woojin is, and to stop wasting time and find him. Another man calls out to Ji-hoo and points to the Skull Guild. Ji-hoo is confused why they entered the dungeon like that, and that they keep messing things up. Because they were told not to interfere by the masters, and he will kill them after this. He tells his men to ignore them, and they just need to focus on taking care of Woojin, and to report it to him instantly, and that he uses poison, so be careful, and kill anyone who interferes. It cuts to a man running, saying he didn't expect to attack the Skull Guild immediately, and blames Woojin. He hides behind a tree and is shocked to see the Skelly boys fighting the Skull Guild, and wonders why he hasn't seen Woojin yet. Woojin quickly drops from above him, and the man goes to attack, but obviously gets beaten. He asks Woojin why he's doing this, and says it's a misunderstanding, because he has no connection to the Skull Guild. Woojin says that's odd, because the man above said he did have one, and he looks up to see one of the dead Skull Guild members. And he says there's no way he would have said anything. It briefly shows the dead man's memories, and the other guy screams out he's never seen him before, and asks why he's doing this, but gets slashed. He falls to the floor, saying he doesn't know anything, and Woojin tells him he'll only speak the truth when he's dead, and activates his memory skill. It cuts to him reading the memories of some Skull Guild members, and there's no information about Ji-hoo, and he wonders if they really weren't sent here by the Messiah Guild, and takes them moving without permission, as the group's falling out. It cuts to night, and we see some players saying they were looking forward to the 3,000 monsters, but it's easier than they thought, and while the players talk, it cuts to Ji-hoo's group saying it's strange. They've yet to run into Woojin, and one of them says he must have run away from them. Ji-hoo then says it seems like he's just a coward, and he's more worried about the Skull Guild's whereabouts. Because they don't know what kind of situation will occur, so bumping into them sooner would be beneficial. Day arrives, and we see Ji-hoo and his group running, and they still haven't seen Woojin, and begin to wonder if he's going to stay hidden. Ji-hoo sees something, then quickly dodges an arrow, and the rest of his men block and dodge them as well. The skeletons arrive, and they say it seems like Woojin's finally arrived, and that he has a necromancer in his group. And begin to laugh at the Skele-boys. He's going to regret it. Woojin appears, and Jihu asks if he's going to use the skeletons to fight, and tells him it's ridiculous. Woojin pats one of the Skele-boys, and Jihu tells him he wouldn't get hurt if he continued to hide, and says it's time to test him. The skeletons rush in at Jihu. He goes to swing at them, but both of them avoid it, and he's confused that they avoided his attacks, and it's his first time seeing skeletons like this. While he's distracted, Woojin quickly dashes in, and swings his blade at Jihu. But Jihu blocks it, and Woojin realizes he's faster than he thought. He twists the sword then strikes down at Jihu, but he blocks it, asking what he's doing, and asks if he made him wait this whole time to show him this trash level of skill. Woojin leaps backward, and realizes this isn't going to be an easy fight. Their Nimbus take an interest in the battle, and Jihu comments on it. And he says he doesn't get the notification unless he's fighting a decent guy, and that it'll be fun. Woojin stares at him, and reiterates that it won't be easy. It cuts to Jinnah eating pizza, asking why he's making a big deal out of nothing. Second asks what he means, and Jinnah asks if he's wondering about what kind of player Woojin is. Second says he knows he's stronger than him, and they continue to banter like they always do. Jinnah says that Woojin is very cunning. Second asks him to explain, and Jinnah says he'll never fight a losing battle, because he wouldn't fight if there were a chance for him to lose. It cuts to a group of Skele-boys being summoned, and Jihu is nervous, because the fight just started, and Woojin summoned all of his skeletons. Woojin walks between the soldiers, and Jihu realizes he doesn't have a companion who summoned them, and then tries to count, but is stupid. Woojin rushes in, and they clash swords, and the Skele-boys follow up behind him. Jihu tells them to bring it on, and we see the Skele-boys just run past him, and he realizes they weren't after him, and he hears his men scream and sees them getting ganged on. One of them begs Jihu for help, and Jihu calls them useless and asks Woojin why he's such a coward. Woojin asks if he just heard a dog barking, and then says it's more like a puppy. Jihu gets angry, saying he's messing with the wrong man. He activates his necklace, and begins to glow, emanating a yellow aura. Woojin is glad he used it. The skeletons get behind him, and he turns around, slicing them, shattering them into pieces. Woojin is surprised by the necklace's skill, but it's time to start the next phase. Woojin yells retreat, and Jihu looks around and sees the skeletons all dip out from the fight, and he wonders if Woojin is going to hide again, but understands he needs to get rid of him before the dungeon ends. He calls to Jihu and tells his men he'll chase Woojin, so deal with the skeletons. Woojin begins to run, and comments on how Jihu doesn't care for his subordinates, and it must be due to his confidence. But it's understandable because of his necklace, which increases every stat, but for someone like him who doesn't know how to utilize it. He notices Jihu behind him, and realizes he can't ignore their stat difference. Piggy is very angry at him. We see Jihu run over some corpses, and we all know what's happening here. They explode right underneath him, and everyone can see the giant explosion, and while one of them panics, the other reminds them to stay calm because it isn't enough to kill Jihu, so to focus on the remaining skeletons. But is quickly hit with an arrow, and screams, being inflicted with poison. They see one of the skeletons, and tells his men they need to brace themselves. The dust settles around Jihu, and he roars, telling Jiwoo to fight him like a man. Woojin, after taking the Reaper's mask off, says he knows he'd lose in a fight with him, so if he wants to catch him, then to run faster. Jihu angrily says he's going to rip him apart, and the chase ensues again, like Tom and Jerry. Jihu activates a haste skill, and quickly catches up to Woojin. Woojin sees it, and when Jihu goes to attack him, the floor begins to crumble from underneath, which surprises him, and he begins to fall down into a pit, which is full of monster corpses, and then an explosion goes off. We see a large crater, and Jihu tells him to stop playing around. Woojin says he's sorry that he's too dumb to understand strategy. Jihu wonders what he means, and Woojin mansplains what strategy is to Piggy, and then he takes shots at him for being a horrible leader. Jihu wonders why he's catching strays, and he recalls an incident of people mocking him for being the sole survivor from his group, and he yells at them to stop talking behind his back. And then Suzuki mocks him for not caring about his subordinates. And then calls him dumb, and says it's obvious after what he did. Jihu rushes at him, but gets dodged, and then gets tripped onto the floor. Jihu says they didn't die because of him, and Suzuki says he's refusing to take the blame, and that he's useless. And he says that Woojin's strategies are very similar to his. And this makes it unbearable, because he wants to kill them both with his own hands. Woojin tells him it's about time, and Jinhoo asks what he means. He lets Jihoo know that his Skelly boys don't need a verbal order. So he didn't need to yell retreat. Jinhoo, shocked, wonders if he did that to lure him out, and Woojin tells him it looks like he understands, and then says his blessing is about to end. Jihoo is confused about how Woojin knows the length of his skill, and yells out, asking who he is. Woojin says it's pathetic he doesn't know yet, and goes to tell him. But Jinhoo just gets confused even more, and the skill ends, putting the necklace on a cooldown. Woojin says it seems like it's ended, and that he's an idiot for falling for that till the end, and Jihoo begins to insult him, but then Woojin says they're done with their job. And we see some feet appear behind Jihoo, and that the Skelly boys have all returned. Woojin tells him he was too tunneled, he doesn't even know where he is. And explains to him that this is where he first came across them, and they just ran in circles. And thanks to the time he bought, the skeletons killed all of his allies, so they could quickly arrive after they finished their job. Jihoo is surprised by his underlings being slaughtered, and then it turns into anger, and he tells him he's looking down on him. Jihoo pushes off the ground with great force, and dashes into Woojin, and swings his sword down at him. Woojin doesn't even bother moving, and Jihoo immediately gets blocked by a Mr. Skelly Bones, and Woojin tells him not to get excited, because it's just starting. It cuts to a car, and Jinna is driving it while complaining about being overworked. He has a file on Jihoo, and he wonders why he needs to go check up on the dungeon, and we see a flashback of Second asking him to do it. And Second says he wants to know if Woojin is doing alright, and Jinna says he's sure that he'll make it back alive, and asks if he's worried that Jihoo will beat him. Second says it's the opposite, and if Jihoo loses, then they'll need to make sure of something but doesn't say what. And how it's the same for Woojin. And that he'd also like to know what their objectives are, like why they had to create the fake alias of Isaac, and how Youngwon is tied to the Skull Guild, and why they keep helping Woojin despite knowing that the Messiah Guild is behind everything, because it's all to take them down. It's difficult to know Woojin's intentions, and they need to confirm if he'll still work with them in the future. It cuts back to a group of Skelly Bones slumped over, and Jihoo is fatigued from his fight, and the poison. He complains there are too many skeletons, and we see one swinging at him, but he blocks it. As he blocks, a skeleton quickly approaches his side. Jihoo notices, but it's too late. Mr. Skelly Bones cuts him like a birthday cake, but Jihoo does not fall. He grits his teeth, and roars while making them social distance from him. He falls now to his knees, as his legs have given out. Woojin says he held up pretty well, and it would have been bad if he didn't use the Mastery Stone to increase his Skelly count. And now that he's fully affected by the poison, he doesn't need to entertain him anymore. Jihoo yells for them to fight him, he swings and eventually falls to the floor. Still repeating to fight him, and that he can continue. But as he crawls, he dies, and we see Woojin gain more authority from his Nimbus. He approaches Jihoo's corpse, and opens his inventory, taking out the necklace that carried him. And he says it's his first time owning an item from one of the Round Table Knights, and because of Jihoo's death, someone will show their face, doesn't say who. He reads Jihoo's memories, and we see Suzuki trash-talking him, then says he meant his subordinates. Jihoo tells him a dog should act like one, and since he's going to see the masters, he'll let it slide, but next time he won't. Suzuki smiles, saying he's looking forward to it. We see Jihoo greeting the great hero, which is revealed to be Sejin. Woojin gets angry seeing his face, and says that if they find out Jihoo died, they will retaliate. But he will ensure that anyone who supported Sejin and ignored justice will pay. We see some orcs on the ground, and some players are attempting to capture a two-headed dog, and one of them tells the other to attack it once it takes their bait, so that they can do it without casualties. But they get a notification about the dog being defeated, and they all make goofy faces while being super lost. The dungeon is cleared, and we see Woojin walking away from the gate, and he's surprised to see Jinna greeting him. He asks what he's doing here, and Jinna says he was in the area, so he stopped by. And he has something to give to Woojin anyway. We see them in the car, and Jinna tells him that Second wants them to enter another dungeon. And then asks how Jihoo was. Woojin expected them to know, and that Jihoo entered a fake alias, which meant Second knew why Woojin wanted a fake alias, and still agreed. Jinna repeats his question, and asks him how he was. Woojin says that he was stronger than Jinna. Jinna quickly barks back, asking if he has a scouter for power levels, and asks him how he knows his true skills. Woojin tells him that Jihu took down 10 of the 12 Skelly boys, and if Jinna wants to prove he's stronger than him, he can test him if he wants to try. Jinna makes a super convincing face, and says a true man shouldn't brag, and quickly changes the topic to work. Woojin tells him about the Horned Fox dungeon, and Jinna says since he knows about it, he'll skip the explanation. And that it's obvious, but he'll be going as Isaac, and he's sure he knows why. And asks what he thinks. Woojin realizes that being sent to another dungeon immediately after beating Jihu means something, and agrees to do it. We see Woojin driving away from Jinna, and Jinna quickly calls Second and tells him that he told him not to worry about Woojin, because he doesn't take a losing fight. Second asks if he agreed to the dungeon, and Jinna tells him agreed without even thinking about it, and he knows the dungeon details already. Second says that's good, and warns Jinna to resolve himself. Because now that Woojin agreed, there is no turning back. Second thinks about how even though he can't trust him entirely, they need to do something now to stand against the Messiah Guild. And that they only have 2 to 3 hours at best, so if someone doesn't come along and put them in check, they won't hide their aggression. Woojin has arrived to his hideout, and he recalls that right after he cleared the Horned Fox dungeon previously, and we see his recruitment into the Messiah Guild. And Woojin tells her that if they want him to join, the guild master himself should ask. A foot exits from a car, and says he likes his guts, and that they need his strength to save the world. Woojin turns around, and Sejin asks if he will be his ally, and this was their first meeting. Woojin receives a text, and Second tells him to show off during the new raid in 2 days. Woojin smirks, and says he bets just like before he returned, the Messiah Guild will be there, and that's good. He plans to shock them all at the value of Isaac as a player. We see him pulling the needle snake leather out from his inventory, and says he'll be busy in order to finish preparing, but since it's a dungeon, he's already cleared once. It will be the perfect experience to show off. It cuts 2 days to the location of the dungeon, and someone yells over the intercom for the players to get ready. And we see Woojin and Jinna exit their car. Woojin asks if he's ready, and Jinna says he's cleared the impossible dungeon, so of course he is, and this'll be easy. But quickly panics as he cannot eat his snacks, due to them freezing. We see someone yell for everyone to enter into their Arctic gear, and she tells them to make sure to look after themselves. Because if they get left behind, they will get in people's way. Woojin compliments her knowledge, and how the environment can be scarier than the mobs. Jinna is shivering, asking how cold it is, if a tank like him is freezing. Woojin tells him it's time to move, and we see them dash off. After a bit, Jinna asks if it wouldn't have been better to move with the Messiah Guild, because acting by themselves in this environment, but gets interrupted, and Woojin asks if he can't use his strength in the cold. Jinna tells him that's nonsense. Jinna says his nickname is the Siberian Brown Bear, and this kind of temperature is nothing to him, and it feels great. Woojin smiles and says it's good to know, and that this dungeon will be harder than their previous one together. Jinna asks how much harder it'll be, and Woojin says he'll know soon enough. Due to the necklace from Jihu, Woojin begins to feel warm, and equips his mask too. He tells Jinna it's time to move, and that they'll feel warmer if they do. Jinna agrees, and asks if he'll be properly fed this time. Jinna asks what his plan is for the dungeon, because it's a survival quest, and if they are going to build a fort again. Woojin says no, and Jinna is glad he doesn't need to build again. The Skelly boys are summoned, and Jinna is flabbergasted by all of the skeletons having upgraded drip. We see them in red armor. Jinna asks why he only bought them leather armor, and not something better, but realizes it's from the needle snake. Jinna is angry that he took all of the leather, and that it would cost so much for just one, but every skeleton has armor. Woojin says his office should have gotten his share, and Jinna yells at the baldy. It cuts to the girl who gave orders earlier, and she realizes 2 people are missing. She asks if anyone saw where Isaac and his companion went, and a player apologizes, saying they were all too busy with building. She says that sorry doesn't cut it, and asks if he forgot their order. We learn that her true goal is to determine if forming an alliance with Isaac is worth it or not. She tells the player to guard the camp, and that she'll scout. The player says she doesn't need to, and she says it's fine, and she needs to see it for herself anyways, how skilled Isaac is. We see some wolves snarling, and then the Skella boys are bodying the dogs, sending them flying through the air. Jinna yells out headshot in Russian, and we see the skeleton boys continuing to put in work. One of them slices a wolf in half, and the woman witnesses this and thinks it's crazy that a skeleton soldier is this strong. One of the players with her asks if they should help, and she says they don't need it, and are showing off that it's their hunting ground, and they'll get in their way. She realizes they are much more skilled than she is, but it's expected of someone who hunted the needle snake. She says she must report it to the guild. She immediately hears the whistle, and realizes it's the emergency whistle. Woojin notices them leaving from their hiding spot, and we see some wolves running through the forest, and the players are attempting to hold them off, while saying they just need to hold on until the captain comes back. Someone quickly jumps from the ground, and leaps through the air slamming into a pile of wolves, turning them into meat crayons. It's the woman from before, and she asks what everyone is doing and that it's just some floor 1 mobs. And instructs them to form a defensive line, and that they'll slowly move back to camp. A wolf atop the cliff begins to howl, and the ground starts to shake and rumble, as a scout from up ahead sees a massive horde of wolves running together, forming a monster wave. The captain is nervous by the fact that what they've been dealing with wasn't even a wave. We see Woojin and Jinna watching the wolves, and Jinna says that everyone will die if they don't help, but there's no way Woojin is thinking of going in, right? It cuts back to Woojin on the phone with Second after having asked him for a skill page, and Woojin thanks him. The skill is called Aura Field, and it will buff, or debuff within a certain area. Woojin learns the skill, and tells Jinna he's glad he doesn't have to explain everything to him anymore. We see the girls group from before is surrounded by wolves against a cliff, and she says she should have paid more attention, and that she was careless because it's just the first floor. An explosion occurs behind the wolves, and one of the men asks if it's reinforcements. The woman says there's nobody else who would be in the dungeon, but then realizes she is wrong, and we see Woojin throwing wolf corpses off the cliff he is standing on, and smirks while exploding them. Jinna bursts out from the explosion, and with the help of some skelly boys, begin to annihilate some wolves. They quickly secure an area amongst the wave. We see that one of the skeletons has the buff from Jihu's necklace, and his eyes glow yellow as the buff begins to spread to all the remaining soldiers. Jinna is confused, as he watches the yellow aura emanating from the Mr. Skelly bones, because he's never seen this before, and he wonders if they've gone crazy or something. They all begin to roar, while turning into super scions. One of them grips his axe, then lets it rip, smacking multiple wolves away. Jinna says it's like watching berserkers, and wonders what Woojin has done. We see him atop the cliff still watching all of this, and he explains that rather than selfishly using the necklace's buff, it's best to share it by using the aura field, and that it's much more efficient. He watches as his soldiers one-sidedly annihilate the wolves, and then throws another corpse down, exploding it again. The woman is shocked that they are acting like a barrier and blocking the monster wave, and realizes this is the true ability of the needle snake hunter. She tells her men that now the wave has been blocked, it's now their chance, and to charge in. It cuts to Second's office, and Secretary Lee asks if they are saving the Messiah Guild. And he tells her yes, because they are praised as heroes, they won't be able to show their saviors hostility. And will be pressured to reward their saviors. So they'll be killing 2 birds with 1 stone, and she says it's a good idea, but will they succeed? Because the Messiah Guild has many skilled players, so to make it work, Woojin will need skills that are much greater than theirs, and he asks if he possesses that. Second says that he certainly does, and he would even be happy to give him a loan. This surprises her, and she asks if he really rates him that highly. He says yes, and while they are in the dungeon, they need to do their best to make sure their identities aren't revealed, so they can continue to farm the rewards. It cuts back to the dungeon, and one of the players says it's finally over, and if the Russians weren't here, it would have been impossible. The girl from before greets Woojin and Jinna, and thanks them. Woojin doesn't respond instantly, and she realizes he might not speak Korean, but he quickly replies in bad Korean on purpose, and leaves. She tells him to wait, and Jinna asks if he forgot about their plan. Woojin says they got rid of the biggest threat, so don't worry. And sticking with them will increase their chances of exposing their identities, and now that they've demonstrated their skills, they won't be able to claim the dungeon as theirs, so now they can farm levels. Jinna says please, no, not again, and Woojin smirks. It cuts to night, and we see Jinna is gassed out, and says he must have gone crazy teaming up with Woojin. A level up notification appears, and we see them both looking at it. Woojin says now he's level 35, he can't ask for any more now. We see he gains more authority, and his poison skill levels up. He looks at the skill, and we see it is at the X rank, not sure if highest or not, and he says now his skill is at this rank, he can realize his plan sooner. Jinna asks why he's making such a serious face, and if there's something wrong. Woojin says no, but before they move to the next floor, there's one thing left they need to do. Jinna asks what he's planning to do now. Woojin says it's to eat, because they'll spend more energy on the next floor. Jinna asks him if it's true, and we see them cooking some food on a fire. While pigging out, Jinna says it seems like they are a real team now, and tells him to eat. Woojin says he's got something to ask beforehand, and says even though he's immortal, he can still feel pain, so would he pass out from pain in the middle of a fight? Jinna says, of course not, and that he's the many lead Jinna, and he won't pass out. Woojin says, if that's the case, then what if he was pierced by the horned fox? How long could he withstand it? Jinna drops his food, and asks if he has done something wrong, and if he should beg for forgiveness. It cuts to the second floor, and we see the players are all just getting toyed with, being sent flying all over the place, and we see something Sonics all over the wall. They wonder how they are meant to fight it, and one of them watches as it lands beside them and then instantly gets caught in its mouth. It then runs through everyone else, and the captain realizes that everyone is going to die at this rate, and that they need to seal its movement somehow. She grinds her teeth while trying to figure out what to do, and then sees Jinna walk in front of her, and tells her that he'll kill the fox for her. She wonders what he's planning to do by himself, and as he walks forward, she tells him he can't just charge in without a plan, and we see the reflection of the horned fox in her eyelids. Jinna approaches it, and it snarls at him, and quickly dashes, bearing its fangs directly at him. He barely dodges, but still gets scraped by it, realizing it's faster than he thought. It turns into Bellamy, and Jinna says it's as Woojin said, and that it's not strong, but insanely quick. So all he can do is block currently. He begins to lose balance, and he realizes this. The horned fox leaps at him, stabbing him, piercing his body. He begins to lose consciousness and recalls Woojin talking to him, that the skeleton soldiers would break too quickly, and a trap would take too long. Jinna says he just needs to stop its movement, right? But it makes sense why he suggested they eat now. Woojin asks him if he can do it or not. Jinna opens his eyes, and grabs a hold of the horned fox, and begins to stop its movements, causing them to slide across the snow. Jinna's blessing activates, and he says it hurts, but he's finally caught a hold of it, and we see he's stopped its movements. The captain is in awe of him actually stopping it, and realizes he won't last forever like this. An arrow flies by her head as she talks about how it'll be for nothing if they don't kill it now. The arrow continues to soar toward the horned fox, and gets closer to its eye, and then hits it. We see it is inflicted with poison, and she turns around to see Woojin holding a bow. He takes a step forward, and we see as the boys begin to haul cheeks to save Jinna. She watches, and is low-key afraid of how strong they are while both being under level 40. And we see the Skelly boys go to work on the horned fox, and she calls them monsters in comparison to them, and says that they are on a whole different level. They successfully kill the horned fox, and the gate begins to open. People flock toward the exiting players, and ask if it was Kang Young-ji girl captain, or if it was Isaac, and that they need to interview them. They watch as a diplomatic car pulls up, and realize it's Isaac's car. Inside of it, we see Woojin pull out the horn from his inventory, and he tells Second to make a statement for him. Second asks why he needs one, and Woojin tells him to let them know if the Messiah Guild wants it, they are willing to donate the horn. Jinna asks if he's crazy after putting him through all of that, just to donate it. Second says he understands, and it's quite a plan. Jinna barks at him too. Woojin adds one more thing, and says to emphasize the, if the guild wants it part. Second says alright. We see on the news that the statement is released, and that Yongji says they would have failed without Isaac. Woojin, in his hideout, reads through these and says he's glad they took care of it so quickly. He quickly receives a phone call from Youngwon, and it cuts to him at his office. And we see on the TV they are trying to find out Isaac's identity, and Youngwon is annoyed that he's all they are talking about. He then says Woojin is better at taking care of things than he thought, and informs him that the Skull Guild left Korea, and are back in Japan. And part of him wants to go and annihilate them. He realizes he's satisfied with how things turned out. And since Woojin kept his side of the deal, he will be rewarded properly. His secretary passes him a skill page, and Yongwan tells him that he needs to continue to grow stronger. The skill is called Blood Mist, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Yongwan reiterates that he needs to become stronger as a member of their elite squad. Woojin tells him he understands. On the TV, we see that the Messiah Guild has released a statement, and they are grateful for Isaac's words, but will only accept the sentiment. And that they will send him a gift to repay him. Yongwan calls them idiots for losing out because of their pride. Woojin gets a flashback of the night prior and says if he remained quiet, they probably would have robbed him of the thorn by stirring up the public. But that only applied to their enemies, and on top of saving their members, he even offered to donate the item. So there's no way for them to paint him in a negative light, and if they wanted the horn, they'd have to pay for it. Woojin then replies to Yongwan's statement about them losing, and tells him it depends on what the Messiah Guild reward him with. Woojin looks at the Blood Mist page, and realizes that the reason Yongwan gave it to him, is to tell him to focus on leveling up, so he asks Yongwan if he secured any dungeons that he can focus on leveling in. Yongwan says yes, and to just purchase some through a broker and send him the invoice, and he'll take care of it. Woojin thanks him while grinning. It cuts to Jinna watching the news while eating, and wondering if Woojin knew this would happen from when he said he'd donate the horn, and now he gets to keep the horn while getting a reward. He tells Second he's curious as to what they'll give him. Second says it'll be a skill to summon golems, and Jinna asks how he knows, and he tells Jinna they've already come to an agreement before their announcement. And regardless, it looks better to gift something before announcing it. And when they offered the skill, they accepted instantly. Jinna says but then screams what does he get, because he worked really hard and now won't get anything. So shouldn't he get table scraps or something, at least? Second puts a lot of snack boxes onto a table, saying here's his table scraps, and that he's been stocking up a present for him. Jinna yells at him that these are gifts sent by the people who think they are Russian. So why is he acting like he bought them, and he wants skills or items too? It cuts to Jinna eating the snacks, and he's asking Second what he's looking at, and we learn it's a dungeon purchase request from Yongwan. Jinna tells him he thought they stopped making deals with him. Because last time Second just cursed Yongwan, and then asked why he would even need a dungeon broker anyway. Second tells him it's because he wants to buy some in order to raise his new elite soldier, and that he sure does love his underlings. Jinna asks who the soldier is, and Second says he knows him well. Jinna guesses that it's Woojin, and then says that they are shaking Yongwan down, and calls them con artists. Second says it's called businesses, and Woojin should teach him this. He shoves a dungeon paper to Jinna, asking what he thinks of it. He says that survival quest only dungeons are rare, so it should sell for a bit. We see the dungeon stats, and it's a 7-day survival quest. Jinna says that it seems like the perfect place to level, and hands it back to Second. Second asks what he's doing, which confuses Jinna, and then he tells him that he needs to go deliver it, because he needs to level up as well. Jinna drops it and begins to tell him he doesn't think it's the best option, and Second tells him to hurry up. It cuts to inside the dungeon, and Jinna is annoyed that he has to do another dungeon with Woojin. Woojin turns around and asks if they should start by going on a light walk while smirking. It cuts to the Hansung Corporation, the #1 financial company in Korea, and they are Messiah's biggest sponsor. We see Shinhai learning about Jihu's death, and how he died while going after Woojin. She asks why Jihu did something nobody asked him to do, then asks about the necklace. The guy panics, and she tells him to retrieve it no matter what. She thinks that while it's not hard to replace Jihu, there is no replacement for the necklace, and that the Skull Guild's failures seem to be a small deal. It's led to great tension between the Masters and the Messiah Guild, which is cracking their alliance. And that the source of all of this is Yongwan, and she wished she eliminated him sooner, and now she can only chip away at his strength. She asks about the new member of Yongwan's elite squad, and the man replies they are trying to get rid of Woojin currently, but Yongwan is doing all he can to protect him, and he's even heavily investing into him. She says to stop with the excuses, and she wants to know the plans to eliminate him. He tells her they formed a team to capture him, and she asks who is leading it. And he tells her it's Suzuki Eiichi. She says she can trust him because he's a round table member, and asks where they are. He tells her they are sitting on standby in Kaesong. We see a level up notification, and Woojin has reached level 40, and gained more inventory slots too. And now, he can use the skills he received earlier. We see Jinna gassed out, and he's impressed by Woojin, and says he's probably the only one who can level up this quickly, because he is so efficient in everything he does, and is even very knowledgeable about the dungeon types, and the monsters in them, including the best way to hunt them, and he seems to know everything. Almost as if he's experienced it all before, if only he knew. Woojin tells him it seems like he can walk out of anything alive now, and he learns the skills he was gifted. Jinna asks now that they've achieved their goal, can they take it easy and clear the dungeon now? Woojin says it's the opposite, and now he got new skills, so he needs to give it his all, so they can figure out how strong they truly are. Jinna begs, and then it cuts to Woojin walking out of the gate, and Jinna crawls from it. Secretary Lee greets them, and quickly runs to Jinna, asking if he is alright. He lets out a grunt, and she asks if he's hurting, and it turns out his grunt was him trying to say hungry. Woojin asks to speak with Second, and she says yes, and hands him a phone. Second asks Lee what's wrong, and Woojin greets him, and tells him he is somewhere he wants to go. Second looks worried that it's Kaesong of all places, and wonders what Woojin is thinking. We learn that after the gates appeared around the world, North Korea opened a small door to receive help from outside. And this is Kaesong, and if you can clear a dungeon, anything is allowed. So it quickly became a city affiliated with a crime. It cuts to a bus driving in Kaesong, and a man is nervously shaking his foot. Another man asks if it's his first time being a shuttle, which confuses the man, and he explains that the man is an inventory mule who will be forced to bring items out from the dungeon. The man says it isn't true, and the other guy says everyone can see it from just one look, and that he doesn't seem like a violent criminal, and asks if he's a con artist. And even though many of them are violent, they are untouchable due to being players. And it's nice, right? He then asks the nervous man how he ended up here. The man says he was betrayed by someone he trusts, and the guy says, damn, he's sure the other guy will pay for it after he works hard, and as he walks away, tells the man if he needs help, then to ask. Of course, it's Woojin in disguise, and he thinks to himself that he'll make Sejin pay for betraying the world. The man from earlier gets a text asking how the shuttleists are, and the man replies, saying it's all good, and they can treat them like trash. The bus enters a gate, and everyone is quickly asked to exit the bus. It cuts to Second's office, and Jinna is saying that Woojin must have gone crazy for wanting to go to Kaesong, and because it's full of criminals, he wonders why Woojin went to the lawless city. Looking at the food bill, Second says the crazy one is Jinna, for leeching off of him. Jinna asks him about the needle snake leather from last time, and Second quickly swaps topics, saying he has yet to learn why Woojin is in Kaesong. Jinna notices this and asks him if he's hiding something. Second ignores him and continues saying it's unlucky timing because that guy is also in Kaesong. Jinna asks who he means, and Second says it's a monster even stronger than Woojin. And that in his level range of 50, nobody is a match against him, and he hopes they don't run into each other. Jinna says there's no shot someone is stronger than Woojin, and if he existed, he would have heard of him already. Second says he probably has, and that he's the Messiah Guild's hunting dog named Suzuki Eiichi. It cuts to him on the phone, and Suzuki is telling someone he'll start the preparations, and when someone asks what that was about, he tells them they have their new target, and that it's Woojin. One of them says he's never heard of Woojin, and we see him exit the bus while they keep talking about how he is probably not an ordinary guy. Suzuki says it's irrelevant, and they need to do their job. And they should quickly clear this dungeon and start investigating him. Then he asks about the shuttles. One of the men say the guy in charge texted them that it was all ordinary, so they can proceed as planned. Suzuki tells them to get everyone ready. Woojin, in disguise, says he didn't think he'd meet him like this, and that he's been avoiding him. He explains that Suzuki was a hunting dog, and once he reached level 100, he became very restricted. Due to that, the Messiah Guild needed a new hunting dog, but it's only something he discovered out later, and if it weren't for that, then Sejin wouldn't have scouted him in person. But regardless, Suzuki is someone he shouldn't underestimate, and he's probably already got Lancelot's ring from Shinhai, so if he is left alone, he will become an unstoppable monster, so he needs to deal with it now. They enter the dungeon, and we see one of the shuttleists killed one of their members and ran away. Suzuki looks at the man's corpse, and another man asks what the plan is. Suzuki turns into Sherlock Holmes, and realizes that the killer has done this quite a few times, and he tells his men to take care of all of the shuttleists. They begin pulling their weapons out from their inventories, and surrounding the shuttles. The man from the bus asks what's going on, and he tells them they don't even have weapons, so chill out. He continues to talk, but one of the men fruit ninja him, and the others watch in fear of the fruit ninja. One screams for the rest to run, and a bloodbath ensues. One of the men tells Suzuki they've taken care of them all, and asks if they should split up and search for the one who ran away. Suzuki tells him that the enemy is trying to drag it out, and since he's alone, he's trying to take them out after they split up, and asks if they need to even entertain such an obvious tactic, and rather finding out information takes priority. They see a tree fall down, and look over to see a golem walking out from the forest, and are curious. Suzuki instantly realizes that the enemy's Nimbus is emissary of the underworld, and that since the man can't use summoning skills without a sacrifice, the golem is a distraction. He tells his men they'll chase after him, but to kill the golem first. Some no-name activates a spell and roots the golem, and yells that golems are resistant to sharp weapons, so swap to a blunt one instead. They begin to light up the golem, by hammering into its legs. Woojin watches and compliments them on their teamwork, and how they are knowledgeable on the golem's weakness. We see them blow its legs off, and as it begins to fall, one of the men leaps above it. He readies his hammer, and strikes down onto its head, causing a giant cloud of dust to emerge. One of the men begins to hear a weird sound, and watches as an arrow flies straight at him, but Suzuki quickly slashes it. The man apologizes, and Suzuki tells him not to underestimate their opponent. Sherlock again notices that Woojin is going for the healer while everyone is distracted, and says that he must be incredibly skilled, and since he can use long-ranged weapons and summons, he wonders who he is. One of the men yells about another attack, and Suzuki turns around, and he and his men see a group of armored figures running at them. One of the men pulls out his bow and says he'll buy them time, so group up. He fires multiple arrows toward the figures, and as the arrows get closer, we see they just pass through the figures' clothing. The man is scared that the enemies didn't even attempt to dodge, and as the cloak breaks, we see one of the Skelly boys ready his sword, and swing at the man, but only manages to cut his face. The man is surprised to see a skeleton soldier, and disengages. The man says it's too nimble for a skeleton soldier, and we see the Skelly boys are engaged in combat with the players, and one of the men is being overpowered due to how careless the soldiers are, and is surprised by how well the Skelly boys fight. Suzuki instantly cuts one of them to pieces, and he says that since they are mimicking their summoner, he now has an idea of how skilled Woojin is. He says nothing good will come out of dragging it out, and dashes past another one of the skeletons, and we see the skeleton is split in half. The man calls out to Suzuki, and Suzuki tells him not to let their guards down, and to treat them like veteran players, so go all out. And since they are using armor, aim for the exposed parts. The man runs off, telling his men to focus on the gaps in their armor. Another skeleton loses his leg, and then another one falls too. Suzuki runs through the battle trying to figure out where Woojin is, because if he can take care of him, the summons will vanish. He sees a figure wearing a cloak, and instantly stops his momentum and turns, dashing toward the figure. He goes for a slash, and quickly cuts the figure in half. He turns around, surprised, and we see between the fabric of the cloak a man wearing a skull mask, and Suzuki wonders if it is Isaac. Another skeleton falls, and one of the players looks over to see Suzuki and a blonde man with a skull mask, instantly recognizing him as Isaac. The man is confused about why someone on good terms with their guild is doing this. Woojin looks at him and decides it's time for his second plan to start. He begins to retreat from the battle. Suzuki realizes that since he's a necromancer, the longer time he has, the worse it'll be for them. One of the players tells Suzuki they need to chase after him, and Suzuki says no, and they must remain on standby. The player gets agitated, and says there's no time for that, and he's weakened now. Suzuki thinks to himself that while it may seem like a good idea, what if, in reality, summoning skills aren't the only skills he has? He yells out it's a trap, and we see a blinding light, followed by a massive explosion, creating a shockwave. A fog begins to envelop the players, and one of them wonder what the fog is, and Suzuki tells his men to be on high alert, because, without their line of sight, they won't know what's next. One of the players walks through the fog, apologizing for losing self-control, but has been poisoned and begins vomiting blood. Suzuki notices this, and one of the players tells the man he'll heal him, but Suzuki stops him saying it's too late. The player drops to his knees, saying it's just poison and he'll be okay, so to heal him quickly. He then rushes at the healer, saying he doesn't want to die, and Suzuki takes away the man's walking privileges, and says there wasn't any info about Isaac using poison, and since it was so lethal, It's strange he didn't use it from the start, and then he realizes something and sees all of his men have cuts. One of the players say it's weird that the fog isn't going away, and then Suzuki's ring activates, and we see it gives him a resistance to poison. Suzuki yells, telling his men to avoid the mist. One of them says he hasn't felt anything, and then all of the players begin to cough profusely. Suzuki realizes this was Woojin's plan, and then one of the skeletons appear behind Suzuki, and then he realizes it's not aiming for him, but his subordinates, and then looks down to see Woojin below him. And they quickly exchange blades and distance themselves. They both instantly notice their nimbuses are interested in the battle, and Woojin realizes he's on a whole different level than Jihu, and if he isn't careful, he will die. It cuts to Second's office, and Secretary Lee is telling him that he was right, and that Woojin entered the same dungeon as Suzuki. Second realizes that Woojin is targeting the Messiah Guild, and that if he makes it back, he will be an incredible ally. Lee asks him what the plan is, and he tells her they need to have something ready. She asks what he means, and he tells her it's the thing she worked hard to gather, the Pharaoh's power. It cuts back to the fight, and we see all of Suzuki's men peacefully taking naps, and Woojin is on his knees while Suzuki kills his last skeleton. Suzuki asks Woojin if there are any more tricks, and Woojin is worried about how much of a gap there is even with the effects of the necklace, and that he's much stronger than he thought, and he was overconfident thinking he was ready for this. Suzuki tells him he's the first person he's struggled against, and acknowledges him, but since he's lost too much blood, he knows he won't last any longer. We see Suzuki is poisoned, but his ring resists it. And he says if it weren't for his ring, he would have died already. And that he's pretty worn out himself, so if he loses any more blood, he will die, while walking to Woojin. He raises his sword and tells him farewell, and Woojin watches, and begins to recall him talking to Yongwan. Yongwan is talking about how due to his poisonous blood, he is unable to receive a blood transfusion, and his secretary hands Woojin something. Yongwan says that it'll be useless in the future, but it may save his life at least once. His eyes glow with tenacity remembering the skill, and he rushes at Suzuki. Suzuki says he's struggling to the end, and Woojin puts his palm on his chest, and we see him cast a skill called blood absorption. Suzuki begins to fall backward and drops his sword, and the two tumble to the floor. We see Suzuki's stats are decreased. Woojin pants while on his hands and knees, and we see he's recovered 5% of his health. He stands up and tells Suzuki he should know that Sejin is a trash person, and asks why he follows him. Suzuki laughs saying is that the reason he attacked him, and that everyone is going crazy for Sejin, but it's not the truth and that the true goal is for the players to rule the world, and that finishing the game is just a facade. As he coughs, Woojin steals his ring, and we see the stats are really strong on the ring. Due to losing the ring, Suzuki is fully poisoned, and Woojin tells him that since he's stronger than him, he should easily accept his fate of dying to him. Suzuki continues to cough, and dies. Woojin reads his memories, and then we see the light clearing the dungeon. In disguise, Woojin walks out, and a man hands him a radio. Second congratulates him on killing Suzuki, and asks if he's going to try to deny it or not. Woojin asks what's wrong with killing a Messiah dog, and Second says there isn't a problem, and he just didn't think he'd cause such a problem, but he got his message now. And that he is very interested in what he's planning to do next, and asks if they can meet after he leaves Kaesong. And since it's an important topic, it should be discussed in person. Woojin says that's fine, and he has no reason to turn it down, if the business is killing the Messiah. Subscribe for more videos like this, leave a like or a comment to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.